Abbey Grace. Chapter 1. The Arrival. The old boarding school house loomed before them, a weathered sentinel against the fading afternoon light. Ben's fingers twitched at his sides, desperate to count, to order, to control something in this chaos of change. 3 steps forward, 3 steps back, 3 steps forward again. "Ben, come on!" Stacy called from the porch, her voice a mix of exasperation and concern. "We need to get inside before it gets dark." He nodded, swallowing hard. The house seemed to watch him, its windows like hollow eyes, judging, waiting. Ben forced himself to move, each step a Herculean effort against the invisible tethers of his mind. As they crossed the threshold, the air changed. It was subtle, a shift in pressure perhaps, or a sudden chill that raised goosebumps on Ben's arms. Stacy didn't seem to notice, bustling about with boxes and muttering about where to put things.
"This place is huge," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the empty foyer.
"We'll have plenty of space to spread out." Ben didn't respond. His eyes darted from corner to corner, cataloguing every crack in the plaster, every scuff on the hardwood floors. There was a pattern here, hidden beneath years of neglect. He could feel it tugging at the edges of his consciousness. "I'll take the boxes upstairs," Stacy continued, hefting a cardboard container labelled kitchen. "Why don't you check out the living room? Maybe start unpacking some of the smaller stuff." Ben nodded again, not trusting his voice. As Stacy's footsteps receded up the creaking stairs, he found himself drawn to a doorway off to the right. The living room was spacious, with high ceilings and large windows that let in the last dregs of daylight. Dust motes danced in the air, swirling in patterns that made Ben's fingers itch to arrange them, to give them order. He set about unpacking, methodically removing books and knickknacks from boxes. Each item had to be placed just so, aligned with invisible lines that only Ben could see. 3 books on this shelf, 3 on the next, 3 more after that. As he worked, the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, to stretch and lengthen beyond what the fading light should allow. Ben paused, a framed photograph clutched in his hands. For a moment, he could have sworn he saw movement in the corner of his eye, a flicker of something small and dark. "Hello," he called, his voice barely above a whisper. Silence answered him, broken only by the distant sounds of Stacy moving about upstairs. Ben shook his head, trying to clear the cobwebs of paranoia that threatened to settle in. It was just nerves, he told himself. Just the stress of the move and the unfamiliarity of the new house. He turned back to his task, but the unease lingered. As he placed the photograph on an end table, his eyes were drawn to the image within the frame. It was an old picture of him and Stacy as children, taken years ago at a family picnic, but something about it seemed off. The longer Ben stared, the more certain he became that the shadows in the background of the photo were moving, shifting like living things. Ben Stacy's voice made him jump. She stood in the doorway, a concerned frown creasing her brow. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." He forced a smile, though it felt brittle on his face. "I'm fine," he lied. "Just adjusting." Stacy's expression softened. She crossed the room and put a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of comfort that made Ben want to simultaneously lean into her touch and flinch away. "I know this is hard for you," she said softly, "but it's going to be okay. We're going to make this work." Ben nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As Stacy turned to leave, he caught another flicker of movement out of the corner of his eye. This time, when he looked, he could have sworn he saw a small figure darting behind the heavy curtains that framed the windows. His heart began to race, the familiar tendrils of panic creeping up his spine. 3 deep breaths in. 3 deep breaths out. 3 deep breaths in again. The counting helped, as it always did, giving him something to focus on besides the growing certainty that something was very, very wrong with this house. As night fell, casting the room into deeper shadow, Ben continued his meticulous unpacking. But with each passing moment, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The house seemed to breathe around him, its walls expanding and contracting like the chest of some great slumbering beast. And somewhere, just on the edge of hearing, Ben could have sworn he heard the faint, haunting strains of a lullaby. "Welcome home," the house seemed to whisper. "Welcome home." Chapter 2. Echoes of the past. Stacy's fingers flew across the keyboard, the soft clacking of keys a counterpoint to the house's eerie silence. The glow of the laptop screen cast strange shadows on the walls of the study, making the room feel smaller, more confined than it truly was. "Come on," she muttered, scrolling through yet another page of local history. "There's got to be something here." Her research into the house's past had become an obsession over the past few days. What had started as idle curiosity had quickly morphed into a burning need to understand the strange energy that seemed to permeate every corner of their new home. A knock at the door made her jump. "Stacy!" Ben's voice was hesitant, barely audible through the thick wood. "Can I come in?" She sighed, rubbing her eyes. "Sure, Ben. Door's open." Her brother slipped into the room, his movements careful and precise. 3 steps to the bookshelf, 3 steps back, 3 steps forward again. Stacy watched him, worry creasing her brow. Ben's OCD rituals had intensified since they'd moved in, as if the very air of the house was exacerbating his condition. "Find anything interesting?" Ben asked, his eyes darting around the room, never quite settling on any one thing. Stacy shrugged, turning back to her screen. "Maybe. There's not much concrete information, but I did find something about the headmistress who ran this place when it was still a school." Ben moved closer, peering over her shoulder. On the screen was an old newspaper article, the text faded and difficult to read, but the headline was clear enough. "Tragedy strikes local girls' school, headmistress found dead." "She killed herself," Stacy said softly, scrolling down to reveal a grainy black-and-white photograph. "In 1919, hanged herself from the old oak tree out front." Ben shuddered, his fingers twitching at his sides. "Why are you looking into this stuff? It's morbid." Stacy turned to face him, her expression serious. "Because something's not right here, Ben. You feel it too, don't you? The way the air feels, heavy sometimes." The noises at night. Her brother's face closed off, a mask of forced calm settling over his features. "It's an old house, Stacy. Old houses make noise." Before she could argue, a sharp bark from outside drew their attention. Duke, their German shepherd, was in the front yard, growling at something near the tree line. "I'll check on him," Ben said quickly, clearly eager for an excuse to end the conversation. He left the room with careful, measured steps, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Stacy turned back to her research, but found her concentration broken. She stood, stretching muscles stiff from hours of sitting, and moved to the window. Outside she could see Ben approaching Duke, who was still fixated on something in the shadows beneath the trees. As she watched, a chill ran down her spine. For just a moment she could have sworn she saw a small figure dart between the trunks. A child, perhaps, in an old-fashioned dress. But when she blinked, there was nothing there but shifting shadows and rustling leaves. A notification ping from her laptop drew her attention. She'd set up alerts for any mentions of the house or the old school, and something new had just popped up. Curious, she returned to her desk and clicked the link. It was an old forum post, buried deep in the archives of a local history website. The poster claimed to be a former student of the boarding school, sharing memories from her time there. Most of it was mundane. Complaints about strict teachers, fond recollections of friendships formed. But one paragraph near the end made Stacy's blood run cold. "I'll never forget little Abbey Grace. She was so quiet, always keeping to herself." The day they found her body was the day everything changed. The headmistress was never the same after that. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear Abby's lullaby in my dreams." Stacy leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Abbey Grace. The name felt important, though she couldn't say why. She made a note to look into it further, a growing sense of unease settling in the pit of her stomach. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. As darkness fell, the house seemed to come alive around her. Floorboards creaked in empty rooms, shadows danced at the edges of her vision, and somewhere, just on the edge of hearing, Stacy could have sworn she heard the faint, haunting strains of a child's lullaby. She shivered, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the room. Whatever secrets this house held, she was determined to uncover them, for Ben's sake and for her own. As if summoned by her thoughts, her brother's voice echoed up from downstairs, tight with barely controlled panic. "Stacy! Stacy!" She was on her feet in an instant, racing towards the sound. As she ran, the lullaby grew louder, its melody twisting into something dark and discordant. And beneath it all, she could hear Ben's ragged breathing, punctuated by the familiar rhythm of his counting. "3," he gasped as she rounded the corner into the living room. "3. Ben stood in the centre of the room, his eyes wide and unfocused. Duke whined softly at his feet, pressing close to his master's legs, and there, on the mantel above the fireplace, the framed family photograph that Ben had unpacked just days before was changed. Where once there'd been just Ben and Stacy as children, smiling at the camera, there was now a third figure. A little girl in an old-fashioned dress, her face obscured by shadows standing just behind them. As Stacy stared in horrified disbelief, the girl's head turned slowly, impossibly, to face her. And though no features were visible in the depths of that inky blackness, Stacy knew with bone-deep certainty that the thing in the photograph was smiling. "Welcome home," a child's voice whispered, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Welcome home. Chapter 3. The locked door, the morning light, filtered weakly through the dusty windows, doing little to dispel the shadows that seemed to cling to every corner of the old house. Stacy stood in the hallway, her hand resting on the cool metal of a doorknob that refused to turn. She jiggled it again, frustration mounting as the door remained stubbornly shut. "Come on," she muttered, giving the knob a sharp twist. "What's your secret?" The locked room had been a source of curiosity since they'd moved in, but after the events of the previous night, it had become an obsession. Stacy couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was behind this door held answers to the strange occurrences plaguing them. Still no luck. Ben's voice made her jump. He stood at the end of the hallway, his posture rigid, eyes darting nervously from the locked door to his sister and back again. Stacy sighed, running a hand through her tangled hair. "No, it's like it's welded shut or something." "We might need to call a locksmith." Ben's face paled at the suggestion. "More strangers in the house." I don't think I can handle that right now." Guilt twisted in Stacy's stomach. In her determination to unravel the house's mysteries, she'd almost forgotten how difficult this move had been for her brother. Ben hadn't left the house in years, his agoraphobia and OCD binding him to familiar spaces as surely as any physical chains. "I'm sorry, Ben," she said softly. "I know this is hard for you. We don't have to decide anything right now." He nodded, his fingers twitching at his sides in that familiar counting rhythm. 3 taps against his thigh. 3 more. 3 again. "Have you?" Ben hesitated, his gaze fixed on a point just over Stacy's shoulder. "Have you seen anything else? Like last night?" The memory of the changed photograph flashed through Stacy's mind, the shadowy figure of the little girl, that sense of wrongness that had permeated the air. She suppressed a shudder. "No," she lied, forcing a smile. "It was probably just a trick of the light. Old houses can play tricks on you, you know." Ben didn't look convinced, but some of the tension seemed to leave his shoulders. "Yeah," he said, "tricks of the light. That makes sense. As if on cue, a loud thump echoed from somewhere downstairs, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Ben flinched, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "It's okay," Stacy said quickly, moving to her brother's side. "It's probably just Duke. You know how clumsy he can be." She made her way down the stairs, Ben following close behind, his steps carefully measured. 3 stairs, pause, 3 more, pause, 3 again. The scene in the living room made Stacy's heart sink. One of the boxes they hadn't yet unpacked had fallen from a shelf, spilling its contents across the floor. Shards of broken glass glittered among the scattered items, framed photos, old trinkets and mementos from their childhood home. "Oh, no!" Ben moaned, his hands fluttering anxiously. "No, no, no!" "It's all out of order. It's all wrong." Before Stacy could stop him, he was on his knees, frantically gathering the spilled items. His movements were jerky, almost manic, as he tried to restore order to the chaos. "Ben, careful," Stacy warned, kneeling beside him. "There's broken glass everywhere." But her brother seemed beyond hearing, lost in his compulsive need to arrange and rearrange. Blood welled from small cuts on his fingers as he sifted through the debris, but he didn't seem to notice. 3 here, he muttered. 3 there, 3 more. It has to be right. It has to be perfect. Stacy's heart ached as she watched him struggle. This was why they'd moved in the first place. Their mother's death had sent Ben into a downward spiral, his rituals becoming more intense, more all-consuming. She'd hoped the change of scenery might help, but now she wondered if she'd only made things worse. As she helped Ben clean up, careful to avoid the sharp edges of broken glass, something caught her eye. Half buried under a pile of old papers was a small leather-bound book. Its cover was worn and faded, but Stacy could just make out the words embossed in gold leaf, "Property of Millicent Grace, Headmistress." Her breath caught in her throat. Could this be the diary of the woman who had hanged herself all those years ago? With trembling fingers, she reached for the book. The moment her skin made contact with the aged leather, a chill swept through the room. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees in an instant, and Stacy could have sworn she heard the faint echo of a child's laughter. Ben's head snapped up, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Before Stacy could respond, a loud bang echoed through the house. It sounded like a door slamming shut with tremendous force. "The locked room," Stacy breathed, realization dawning. They raced back upstairs, Ben's usual measured pace forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. When they reached the hallway, Stacy's suspicions were confirmed. The door that had been stubbornly shut just minutes before now stood wide open, revealing a dark, musty space beyond. As they stood frozen in the hallway, staring into the shadows of the newly opened room, a small figure darted past the doorway. It was there and gone in an instant, a fleeting glimpse of a child in an old-fashioned dress, her face hidden by a curtain of dark hair. "Abbey," Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. "Abbey Grace." Stacy turned to her brother, shock written across her features. "How do you know that name?" But Ben's attention was fixed on something behind her. His face had gone deathly pale, his eyes wide with terror. Slowly, dreading what she might see, Stacy turned. There, on the wall of the locked room, words were appearing as if carved by an invisible hand. The scratching sound of nails on plaster filled the air as the message took shape. "Welcome home, Ben. I've been waiting for you." As the final letter was etched into the wall, a high, childish giggle echoed through the house. And in that moment, as fear clawed at her throat and Ben's panicked breathing filled her ears, Stacy knew with bone-deep certainty that moving into this house had been a terrible, terrible mistake. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Walls. The house creaked and settled around Ben as he sat rigid on the edge of his bed, eyes fixed on the shadowy corners of his room. Sleep had become a distant memory, chased away by the constant nagging feeling of being watched. Every sound, every shift of shadow sent his heart racing. 3 deep breaths in, 3 deep breaths out, 3 deep breaths in again. The familiar rhythm of his counting provided little comfort now. Not with the memory of those words etched into the wall of the locked room still fresh in his mind. "Welcome home, Ben. I've been waiting for you." A soft knock at his door made him flinch. "Ben!" Stacy's voice was muffled, hesitant. "Can I come in?" He cleared his throat, trying to force some semblance of normalcy into his voice. "Yeah, it's open." Stacy entered, her face drawn with worry. She barely slept either, spending most of the night researching the house's history and trying to make sense of what they'd seen. "How are you holding up?" Ben shrugged, his fingers tapping out a steady rhythm against his thigh. "I'm fine," he lied. "Just adjusting." Stacy sighed, perching on the edge of the bed beside him. "Ben, we need to talk about what happened, about what we saw." "No," he said sharply, standing up and moving to the window. "No, we don't. It was nothing. Tricks of the light, remember? Old houses playing tricks." "Ben, please," Stacy pleaded. "You can't just ignore this we both saw." "I said no." Ben's voice rose, edged with panic. "It's not real." "It can't be real. If it's real, then I'm—" He broke off, his breathing ragged. Stacy stood, reaching out to him, but Ben flinched away from her touch. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't deal with this right now. Please, just leave me alone." With a heavy heart, Stacy nodded and left the room. As the door closed behind her, Ben slumped against the wall, sliding down to sit on the floor. He pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to block out the world, to find some sense of order in the chaos of his thoughts. That's when he heard it. A whisper, so faint he almost missed it beneath the sound of his own ragged breathing. "Ben, Ben, come play with me, Ben." His head snapped up, eyes darting around the empty room. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. Silence answered him, broken only by the steady tick of the clock on his nightstand. 3 ticks, 3 more, 3 again. Ben latched onto the sound, using it to anchor himself as he slowly stood. Just as he convinced himself he'd imagined the voice, a giggle echoed from somewhere behind the walls. It was high and childish, filled with a dark glee that made Ben's skin crawl. "Stop it," he whispered, pressing his hands over his ears. "You're not real. You can't be real." "Oh, but I am," the voice sing-songed, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I'm as real as you are, Ben, as real as this house, as real as your fear." Ben squeezed his eyes shut, his whole body trembling. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a hallucination, a product of stress and lack of sleep. It couldn't be. A cold hand brushed against the back of his neck, and Ben's eyes flew open with a strangled cry. He whirled around, but there was nothing there, nothing but shadows and the lingering sensation of icy fingers on his skin. "Ben?" a new voice called from downstairs, startling him out of his panic. "Ben, are you up there?" For a moment he couldn't place the voice. Then recognition dawned, bringing with it a wave of relief so intense it made him dizzy. "Elizabeth!" he called back, his voice cracking. Footsteps on the stairs, then Elizabeth appeared in the doorway. She was Stacy's best friend, a psychologist who had been helping Ben with his OCD for years. Her presence was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. "Hey," she said softly, taking in his dishevelled appearance and wild eyes. "Stacy called me. She's worried about you." Ben nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Elizabeth stepped into the room, her movements slow and deliberate, as if approaching a spooked animal. "Want to tell me what's going on?" she asked, keeping her voice calm and even. Ben opened his mouth, then closed it again. How could he explain what he'd experienced without sounding completely insane? I don't know," he finally managed. "Everything's wrong. The house, there's something." Elizabeth nodded encouragingly. "Take your time. Start from the beginning, so Ben did. The words poured out of him in a rushed, disjointed stream. He told her about the whisperings, the laughter, the cold touch on his neck. About the locked room and the message on the wall, about Abbey Grace and the constant overwhelming feeling of being watched. As he spoke, Elizabeth listened without interruption, her face a mask of professional concern. When he finally fell silent, she reached out and gently took his hand. "Ben," she said softly, "I know this all feels very real to you, but I want you to consider something. You've been under an enormous amount of stress lately. The move, your mother's death. It's a lot for anyone to handle, especially someone with your condition." Ben frowned, pulling his hand away. "You think I'm imagining it all?" Elizabeth sighed. "I think your mind is trying to process a lot of trauma and change. Sometimes, when we're overwhelmed, our brains can play tricks on us, make us see or hear things that aren't really there." "But Stacy saw it too," Ben protested. "The photograph, the locked room." "Stacy's under a lot of stress too," Elizabeth pointed out gently. "And she's always been very protective of you. It's possible that her concern for your well-being is causing her to. Validate your experiences, even if she's not actually seeing the same things." Ben stood up abruptly, pacing the length of the room. "So, you think we're both crazy?" "No, Ben, that's not what I'm saying at all." Elizabeth's voice was patient, measured. "I'm saying that you've both been through a lot, and it's affecting you in ways you might not realize. I think it might be helpful for you to start behavioral therapy again, give you some tools to manage these thoughts and experiences." As Elizabeth spoke, laying out a treatment plan and strategies for coping, Ben found his gaze drawn to the mirror hanging on his closet door. For a moment, just a split second, he could have sworn he saw a figure standing behind him. A little girl in an old-fashioned dress, her face hidden by a curtain of dark hair. He blinked, and the image was gone. But the whisper that followed sent a chill down his spine. "They'll never believe you, Ben, but I'm here. I'll always be here." Ben turned back to Elizabeth, forcing a smile that felt brittle on his face. "Yeah," he said, cutting off her explanation mid-sentence. "Yeah, therapy sounds good. Whatever you think is best." As Elizabeth beamed at him, clearly pleased by his apparent cooperation, Ben felt something inside him harden. They didn't believe him, they thought he was losing his mind, but he knew the truth. Abbey Grace was real, and she was here, in this house. And somehow, for reasons he couldn't begin to understand, she had chosen him. Chapter 5. The photograph. The attic was a maze of shadows and forgotten things, the air thick with dust and the musty scent of age. Stacy picked her way carefully through the clutter, flashlight beam dancing over piles of old furniture and stacks of mildewed boxes. "There has to be something up here," she muttered, more to herself than to Ben, who hovered nervously near the attic entrance. "Some clue about what's happening in this house?" Ben didn't respond, his attention fixed on the shadows that seemed to writhe and twist in the corners of the room. 3 steps forward, 3 steps back, 3 steps forward again. The familiar rhythm was a lifeline in the chaos of his thoughts. Stacy's light caught on something half buried under a stack of old newspapers. She knelt, brushing aside the yellowed pages to reveal a small, ornate photo album. Its cover was faded leather, embossed with delicate golden filigree. "Ben!" she called, excitement colouring her voice. "Come look at this." Reluctantly, Ben made his way over, each step carefully measured. As Stacy opened the album, a chill seemed to sweep through the attic, making both siblings shiver. The first few pages held what one might expect, faded sepia photographs of stern-faced women in high-collared dresses, groups of young girls lined up in front of the house. But as they turned the pages, Ben felt a growing sense of unease. "Wait," he said suddenly, his hand shooting out to stop Stacy from turning to the next page. "Go back," Stacy obliged, flipping back to the previous photograph. It showed a group of girls, probably no more than 10 or 11 years old, posed in the house's front yard. Most were smiling, their faces bright with youthful enthusiasm. But one girl, standing slightly apart from the others, caught Ben's eye. She was small for her age, with long dark hair that fell in a curtain around her pale face. Unlike her classmates, she wasn't smiling. Instead, she stared directly at the camera with an intensity that seemed to pierce through time itself. "That's her," Ben whispered, his finger hovering just above the girl's image. "That's Abbey Grace." Stacy leaned in, squinting at the faded photograph. "How can you be sure?" Before Ben could answer, a gust of wind tore through the attic, scattering papers and sending dust swirling into the air. The temperature plummeted, their breath visible in sudden puffs of white vapor, and then they heard it, a child's voice, singing softly in the darkness. "Ring around the rosy, pockets full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down." The flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into total darkness. Ben's breathing quickened, edging towards panic. "Stacy," he called, reaching out blindly. "I'm here," she reassured him, her own voice tight with fear. Just stay calm. The batteries must have died." But even as she spoke, a pale greenish light began to emanate from the photograph album. It cast eerie shadows on the walls, transforming the cluttered attic into a nightmare landscape of twisted shapes and grasping tendrils. With trembling hands, Stacy turned to the next page of the album. The photograph there made her gasp in horror. It was Abbey Grace again, but this time she was alone. The background was blurred and indistinct, as if the photographer's hands had been shaking. Abby's face was in sharp focus, her eyes wide and filled with an emotion Stacy couldn't quite name. Fear, anger, triumph. But it was the rest of the image that sent ice through Stacy's veins. Because Abby wasn't alone after all. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows, were things. Dark, writhing shapes with too many limbs and eyes that glowed with an unholy light. "Oh God," Stacy breathed, unable to look away from the horrifying image. "What is this?" Ben didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on a point just over Stacy's shoulder, his face a mask of terror. Slowly, dreading what she might see, Stacy turned. There, in the shadows behind them, stood Abbey Grace. She looked just as she had in the photograph, small, pale, with long dark hair obscuring much of her face. But her eyes were black pits of endless darkness, filled with a hunger that made Stacy's soul shrivel. "Hello," Abby said, her voice a discordant mix of childish sweetness and ancient malevolence. "Would you like to play a game?" Before either of them could react, the attic erupted into chaos. Objects flew through the air as if thrown by invisible hands. The temperature dropped even further, frost crystallizing on the windows and creeping across the floor. And through it all, Abby's laughter rang out, high and cruel and filled with a joy that was somehow worse than any expression of anger could have been. Stacy grabbed Ben's hand, pulling him towards the attic entrance. "Run!" she shouted, her voice nearly lost in the cacophony of shattering glass and splintering wood. They stumbled down the stairs, Abby's laughter following them like a physical presence. As they reached the second-floor landing, a deafening crash came from below. Duke's frantic barking filled the air, punctuated by growls that sounded far too deep and menacing to have come from their gentle German shepherd. "Duke!" Ben cried, his fear for himself momentarily overshadowed by concern for the dog. They rushed down to the first floor, skidding to a stop in the living room doorway. The scene that greeted them was one of utter chaos. Furniture was overturned, books and papers scattered across the floor, and in the centre of it all stood Duke, hackles raised, teeth bared in a snarl that neither of them had ever heard from him before. The dog's eyes, usually a warm brown, now glowed with an eerie red light. As they watched in horror, Duke's form seemed to ripple and shift, his body elongating in ways that defied natural anatomy. "No," Stacey whispered, her voice choked with tears. "No, please, not Duke." But it was too late. Whatever had taken hold of their beloved pet was far beyond their power to stop. Duke's snarl transformed into something that was half bark, half human scream, filled with a rage and pain that tore at their hearts. And behind it all, echoing through the house like a twisted lullaby, they could still hear Abbey Grace's song. "Ring around the rosy, pockets full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down." As Duke lunged towards them, his form now more shadow than substance, Ben and Stacey clung to each other. In that moment, faced with the terrifying transformation of their loyal companion, they both realized that the evil in this house was far more powerful and far more personal than they had ever imagined. And it was only just beginning to play. Chapter 6. The Basement Incident. The basement door loomed before Ben, a dark maw yawning open in the dim hallway light. His hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling slightly. 3 deep breaths in, 3 deep breaths out. 3 deep breaths in again. "It's just a basement," he muttered to himself, trying to summon courage from the familiar rhythm of his words. Just a normal, ordinary basement. But even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't true. Nothing about this house was normal or ordinary, least of all what lurked beneath their feet. The events of the past few days weighed heavily on Ben's mind. Duke's terrifying transformation had left them all shaken. The dog was back to normal now, or as normal as he could be given the circumstances. But the memory of those glowing red eyes and that inhuman snarl still haunted Ben's dreams. With a final steadying breath, Ben turned the knob and pulled the door open. The hinges creaked ominously, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. Stale, musty air wafted up from the darkness below, carrying with it the faint scent of something off, something rotten. Ben fumbled for the light switch, his fingers scrabbling against the wall. When he finally found it, the single bare bulb that flickered to life did little to dispel the gloom. Shadows clung to the corners, deep and impenetrable. Step by careful step, Ben made his way down the stairs. Each one creaked under his weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. 3 steps. Pause. 3 more. Pause. 3 again. As he reached the bottom, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Ben's breath fogged in front of him, little puffs of vapour that dissipated into the gloom. He pulled his sweater tighter around himself, trying to ward off the chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. The basement was cluttered with the detritus of decades, old furniture draped in dusty sheets, stacks of mouldering boxes, rusted tools hanging on the walls. But it was what lay beyond these mundane objects that drew Ben's attention. There, in the furthest corner of the basement, was a door. It was old, the wood warped and stained with age. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, twisting patterns that seemed to writhe and shift in the dim light. Ben's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the door. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to flee up the stairs and never return to this place. But something stronger than fear propelled him forward. A need to know, to understand the secrets that this house held. As he reached out to touch the door, a whisper drifted through the air. "Ben, Ben, come play with me, Ben." He whirled around, eyes wide with fear. "Who's there?" He called, his voice cracking. Silence answered him. But as he turned back to the door, movement caught his eye. One of the dusty sheets covering an old piece of furniture was moving, rippling as if stirred by an unfelt breeze. Slowly, inexorably, the sheet began to rise. It took shape, forming the vague outline of a small figure, a child's figure. "Abby," Ben breathed, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. The sheet-draped form turned towards him, and though he couldn't see a face, Ben felt the weight of its gaze. Cold dread pooled in his stomach as the figure began to move towards him, its movements jerky and unnatural. Ben stumbled backward, his back hitting the mysterious door. The carved symbols seemed to burn against his skin even through his sweater. He fumbled for the doorknob, desperate for escape, but his fingers found only smooth, unbroken wood. The sheet-draped figure was closer now, close enough that Ben could hear a soft, rhythmic sound coming from beneath the fabric. It took him a moment to recognize it for what it was, humming. The thing was humming a lullaby. "Please," Ben whimpered, pressing himself against the door, "please, leave me alone." The humming grew louder, and the figure reached out one cloth-draped arm. Ben could only watch in horror as it drew nearer and nearer. Suddenly a hand grabbed his arm. Ben let out a strangled cry, jerking away. "Ben! Ben, it's me!" Stacy's voice cut through his panic. "It's okay, you're okay!" Ben blinked, his vision clearing. He was still in the basement, but the sheet-draped figure was gone. There was only Stacy, her face etched with concern. "What? What happened?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Stacy's brow furrowed. "I heard you yelling when I came down. You were just standing here, staring at nothing." Ben looked around wildly, but there was no sign of the mysterious door or the ghostly figure. Just the normal, cluttered basement. "But I saw. There was a door and Abbey." Stacy's expression softened. "Ben, there's no door here, and Abbey. She's not real, remember? We talked about this." But even as she spoke, Stacy's eyes darted around the basement, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. She'd seen too much in the past few days to entirely discount Ben's experiences. "Come on," she said gently, tugging on Ben's arm. "Let's go back upstairs. I've got something to show you." In a daze, Ben allowed himself to be led up the stairs and into the living room. There, spread out on the coffee table, was an array of electronic equipment, cameras, monitors, motion sensors. "What's all this?" Ben asked, some of the fog clearing from his mind. Stacy took a deep breath. "I've been thinking. If there really is something unusual going on in this house, we need proof. I'm going to set up cameras throughout the house. We'll be able to monitor everything, 24/7. Ben stared at the equipment, a mix of hope and dread swirling in his chest. On one hand, the idea of having concrete evidence of what he'd been experiencing was a relief. On the other, what if we see something we can't explain? He asked softly. Stacy met his gaze, her expression determined. "Then deal with it. Together. Whatever's happening here, Ben, we're going to figure it out. I promise." As Stacy began explaining her plan for camera placement, Ben found his gaze drawn to the basement door. It stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible in the gap. And for just a moment he could have sworn he heard the faint strains of a lullaby drifting up from below. Chapter 7. Family Tensions. The kitchen was filled with the acrid smell of burnt toast and the sound of Stacy's increasingly heated phone conversation. She paced back and forth, free hand gesticulating wildly as she argued with the person on the other end of the line. "No, Sarah, you don't understand. We can't just leave." "It's not that simple," Stacy hissed, trying to keep her voice down. She glanced towards the living room where Ben sat, his gaze fixed on one of the newly installed camera feeds. "Ben's condition. It's getting worse. He needs stability right now." A muffled voice responded, the tone clearly agitated even from across the room. Stacy's face hardened. "Don't you dare bring Mom into this," she snapped. "You weren't here. You didn't see what it was like for him after the funeral. You don't get to judge when you've been MIA this whole time." Ben flinched at the mention of their mother, his fingers twitching in that familiar counting rhythm. 3 taps against his thigh. 3 more. 3 again. He tried to focus on the camera feed, watching the empty hallway for any sign of movement, but Stacy's words kept dragging his attention back to the kitchen. "No, I'm not going to just commit him already." Stacy's voice rose, anger overriding her attempt at discretion. "He's our brother, Sarah. He needs our help, not to be locked away somewhere." There was a pause as Sarah apparently responded, Stacy's next words were low and dangerous. "If that's how you feel, then maybe you shouldn't come visit at all. We're doing fine without you." The call ended with a harsh beep as Stacy jabbed the end button. She stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, before turning to find Ben watching her from the doorway. "How much of that did you hear?" she asked, her voice softening. "Enough," Ben replied, his own voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah thinks I should be institutionalized." Stacy crossed the room, reaching out to her brother, but Ben flinched away from her touch. "Ben, no. That's not going to happen. I won't let it." "Maybe she's right," Ben said, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Maybe I am losing my mind. Maybe that would be easier for everyone." "Don't say that," Stacy pleaded. "We're going to figure this out. The cameras will show us what's really going on here." As if on cue, a shrill beeping erupted from the living room. They rushed in to find one of the monitors flashing red, indicating motion detected in the upstairs hallway. On the screen, they watched as a small, dark figure darted past the camera. It was there and gone in an instant, but the image was unmistakable, a child in an old-fashioned dress. "Abby," Ben breathed, his face pale. Stacy stared at the screen, her earlier certainty evaporating. That's not possible. There has to be an explanation." But even as she spoke, more alarms began to sound. In quick succession, cameras throughout the house picked up flashes of movement, shadows that shouldn't exist, objects moving on their own, and in every frame, just at the edge of visibility, was Abbey Grace. Ben's breathing quickened, edging towards panic. "It's happening again. It's all happening again." Stacy reached for her brother, but he was already retreating, backing away from the monitors with wild eyes. "Ben, wait!" But he was gone, fleeing up the stairs to the supposed safety of his room. Stacy heard his door slam, followed by the familiar sound of Ben's voice, raised in a frantic chant. "3 is safe. 3 is right. 3 keeps the darkness out of sight." Over and over he repeated the words, a mantra, against the horrors that surrounded them. Stacy sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. How had things spiraled so far out of control? The sound of breaking glass made her jump. She looked up to find that the framed family photograph on the mantel had fallen, its glass front shattered on the hardwood floor. With trembling hands, Stacy picked up the photo. It showed her, Ben, and Sarah as children, standing with their parents in front of their old house. But as she stared at the image, a chill ran down her spine. There, standing just behind them, was a figure that hadn't been there before. A little girl in an old-fashioned dress, her face obscured by shadow. As Stacy watched in horror, the figure in the photograph seemed to move. Its head turned slowly, impossibly, until it was facing directly out of the picture. And though no features were visible in the depths of that inky blackness, Stacy knew with bone-deep certainty that the thing was smiling. A child's laughter echoed through the house, high and cruel and filled with a joy that was somehow worse than any expression of anger could have been. From upstairs, Ben's chanting took on a desperate, terrified edge. And in that moment, as the laughter mingled with her brother's fearful mantra, Stacy realized that they were trapped in a house that seemed intent on tearing them apart, haunted by a presence that defied all rational explanation. The cameras had been meant to provide answers. Instead, they had only confirmed their worst fears. Whatever was happening in this house, it was real. It was powerful. And it was only just beginning. Chapter 8, The Music Box.
The attic was still, the air heavy with dust and secrets.
Stacy moved carefully through the clutter, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. After the events of the past few days, she had become determined to uncover every secret this house held, no matter how dark. A glint of metal caught her eye, and she paused, kneeling beside a stack of old boxes. With careful hands, she lifted a small, ornate object from its resting place. It was a music box, tarnished with age but still beautiful. Delicate filigree covered its surface, and a small key protruded from one side. Stacy's heart quickened. Could this be another clue to the house's mysterious past? She turned the key slowly, wincing at the harsh grinding sound it made. For a moment nothing happened. Then, with a soft click, the lid sprang open. A haunting melody filled the air, notes tinkling in a slow, mournful waltz. Stacy found herself holding her breath, entranced by the bittersweet tune. As the music played, the air around her seemed to shimmer, like heat waves rising from sun-baked asphalt. And then she saw her. A small figure materialized in the center of the attic, flickering like an old film projection. It was a young girl, no more than 10 years old, dressed in a high-collared dress that Stacy recognized from the photographs they'd found. Her long, dark hair fell in a curtain around her face, obscuring her features. "Abby!" Stacy breathed, her voice barely audible over the music box's melody. The figure's head snapped up at the sound of her name, and Stacy found herself staring into eyes that were impossibly old, impossibly dark. A chill ran down her spine as Abby's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth, no humanity. "You found my music box," Abby said, her voice a discordant mix of childish sweetness and ancient malevolence. "Mother always said music had power. She was right, you know. It has the power to summon, to control, to destroy." Stacy's hands shook as she held the music box. She wanted to close it, to silence the melody that seemed to be thinning the veil between worlds, but her fingers wouldn't obey. "What do you want?" Stacy managed to ask, her throat tight with fear. Abby's form flickered, and for a moment, Stacy caught a glimpse of something else beneath the child's visage, something dark and writhing and utterly inhuman. Then it was gone, and Abby was just a little girl again. A little girl with eyes that had seen eternity. "I want to play," Abby said, her voice echoing strangely in the confines of the attic. "I've been alone for so long, but now you're here. You and Ben, we're going to have so much fun together." The temperature in the attic plummeted, frost crystallizing on the windows and creeping across the floor. Stacy's breath came out in white puffs as she scrambled backward, the music box clutched to her chest. "We're not going to play your games, Abby," Stacy said, trying to inject steel into her voice. "Whatever you are, whatever you want, you need to leave us alone." Abby's laughter filled the air, high and cruel. "Oh, but you don't have a choice. The game has already begun, and I always win." With a final discordant note, the music box's melody came to an end. Abby's form flickered once more and then vanished, leaving Stacy alone in the suddenly silent attic. For a long moment, Stacy sat there, her heart pounding in her chest. Then, with shaking hands, she closed the music box's lid and tucked it into her pocket. Whatever this thing was, whatever power it held, she couldn't risk leaving it here for Abby to use again. As she made her way back downstairs, Stacy's mind raced. How could she explain what she'd seen to Ben? How could she protect him from a force that seemed to defy all logic, all reason? She found her brother in the living room, his eyes glued to the camera feeds. Ben looked up as she entered, his face pale and drawn. "Did you hear it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The music." Stacy nodded, sinking onto the couch beside him. "I found something in the attic, a music box. And, Ben, I saw her. I saw Abby." Ben's eyes widened, a mix of fear and vindication crossing his features. "You believe me now? You believe it's all real?" Stacy hesitated, the weight of the music box heavy in her pocket. "I don't know what to believe anymore, but I know what I saw, and I know we're in danger." As if in response to her words, a low, ominous creaking echoed through the house. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the very foundations were shifting beneath them. Ben's hands began to twitch, tapping out that familiar rhythm. 3 taps, 3 more, 3 again. "What are we going to do?" he asked, his voice trembling. Stacy reached out, taking her brother's hand in hers. "We're going to fight," she said, injecting a confidence into her voice that she didn't quite feel. Whatever this thing is, whatever Abby wants, we're not going to let her win." But even as she spoke, Stacy couldn't shake the chill that had settled in her bones. The music box in her pocket seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, a constant reminder of the malevolent presence that had invaded their lives. And somewhere in the house, just beyond the reach of sight, she could have sworn she heard the faint echo of Abby's laughter. The game, it seemed, was indeed just beginning, and the stakes were higher than Stacy could have ever imagined. Chapter 9. The medium arrives. The doorbell's chime echoed through the house, causing both Ben and Stacy to jump. They exchanged a nervous glance before Stacy moved to answer it. Ben hung back, his fingers tapping out their familiar rhythm against his thigh. On the porch stood a man who seemed to embody contradictions. He was tall and lean, with long silver hair tied back in a ponytail, but his face was youthful, unlined. His eyes, a startling shade of violet, seemed to look through Stacy rather than at her. "You must be Roman," Stacy said, stepping aside to let him in. The man nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "And you must be Stacy. I could feel the energy of this place from halfway down the street. You were right to call me." As Roman entered, his gaze swept the foyer, taking in every detail. When his eyes fell on Ben, who was hovering uncertainly in the doorway to the living room, something in his expression shifted. "And you must be Ben," Roman said softly. "The house has taken quite an interest in you, hasn't it?" Ben's eyes widened, his tapping becoming more frantic. "How did you?" Roman's smile turned sad. "I can see the marks it's left on you, like fingerprints on your soul." Stacy cleared her throat, drawing Roman's attention back to her. "Can you help us? Can you make it stop?" Roman's expression turned serious. "I can try, but first I need to understand what we're dealing with." "You mentioned a spirit in your call, a child." Stacy nodded, leading Roman into the living room. As they settled onto the couch, she recounted everything that had happened since they moved in: the whispers, the apparitions, the music box. Ben chimed in occasionally, his voice trembling as he described his encounters with Abby. Roman listened intently, his strange eyes never leaving their faces. When they finished, he was silent for a long moment. "This is unusual," he finally said. "The spirit you're dealing with, Abby, she's not just a simple ghost. There's something more at work here. Something older, darker." "What do you mean?" Stacy asked, a chill running down her spine. Roman's gaze drifted to the windows, where the last light of day was fading. "Sometimes, when a place has seen great tragedy or evil, it becomes a beacon for darker forces. They're drawn to the pain, the fear, they feed on it, and if they find a vessel like your Abbey, they can become incredibly powerful." Ben made a small, frightened sound. "So what do we do?" Roman turned back to them, his expression resolute. "We need to make contact, to understand what Abby wants, what's keeping her here, and then perhaps we can help her move on." "You want to talk to her?" Stacy asked incredulously. "After everything she's done." Roman nodded. "It's the only way. We need to confront this head-on. I suggest we hold a séance tonight. The veil between worlds is thinnest at midnight. It will be our best chance to make contact." As night fell, Roman set about preparing the living room. He arranged candles in a circle on the floor, their flickering light casting dancing shadows on the walls. In the center, he placed a small table with the music box Stacy had found. "Are you sure about this?" Ben whispered to Stacy as they watched Roman work. "What if something goes wrong?" Stacy squeezed her brother's hand. "We have to try, Ben. We can't live like this anymore." As the grandfather clock in the hall began to strike midnight, Roman gestured for them to join him in the circle. They sat cross-legged on the floor, joining hands. "Whatever happens," Roman said, his voice low and intense, "do not break the circle. The energy we're about to channel is powerful and unpredictable. Breaking the connection could be dangerous." With that ominous warning, Roman began to chant in a language neither Ben nor Stacy recognized. The candles flickered, their flames growing taller, casting wild shadows across the room. For a long moment nothing happened. Then, slowly, impossibly, the key on the music box began to turn on its own. The haunting melody filled the air, and with it came a cold so intense it stole the breath from their lungs. Frost crept across the windows, patterns of ice forming intricate, twisted designs. "Abbey Grace," Roman called, his voice resonating with power. "We call you forth. Show yourself to us." The air in the center of the circle began to shimmer, coalescing into a small, dark figure. Abbey appeared much as she had before, a young girl in an old-fashioned dress, her face obscured by long, dark hair. But something was different this time. Something was wrong. As Abbey raised her head, Stacy had to bite back a scream. The face beneath the hair was not that of a child. It was a writhing mass of shadows, with eyes that burned like coals in the darkness. "You called?" Abby's voice rasped, a sound like breaking glass and screaming wind. "Here I am." Roman's hand tightened on Stacy's, his voice strained but steady. "Abbey Grace, we seek to understand. Why are you here? What do you want?" Abby's laugh was a terrible thing, filled with a malevolent glee that sent shivers down their spines. "Want? I want to play. I want to dance. I want to tear this world apart and watch it burn." As she spoke, the shadows around her began to writhe and grow, tendrils of darkness reaching out towards the circle. "This isn't Abbey," Roman gasped, his face pale with strain. "This is something else, something that's taken her form," Ben whimpered, his eyes wide with terror. "Make it stop. Now please make it stop." But Abbey, or the thing wearing Abby's form, wasn't finished. "Poor broken Ben," it crooned, its voice a mockery of childish sweetness. "So afraid, so alone. Don't you want to play with me, Ben? Don't you want to be free?" One of the shadow tendrils reached for Ben, brushing against his cheek. He cried out, jerking back. And in that moment of fear and pain, he did the one thing Roman had warned against. He broke the circle. The moment Ben's hand left Stacy's, chaos erupted. The candles flared into pillars of flame, then guttered out, plunging the room into darkness. The music box's melody twisted into a cacophony of discordant notes. And Abby began to laugh. "Free!" she cackled, her form expanding, filling the room with writhing shadows. "Free at last!" Roman's voice cut through the darkness, chanting frantically in that strange language. But it was too late. The malevolent energy they had channeled was loose, uncontrolled. Objects began to fly around the room, smashing against walls. The temperature plummeted, ice crackling across every surface, and through it all, Abby's laughter echoed, a sound of pure, unhinged glee. Ben Stacy screamed, reaching blindly for her brother. "Ben, where are you?" But Ben's voice, when it came, was eerily calm. "It's okay, Stacy," he said, his words barely audible over the chaos. "I understand now. I know what I have to do." As suddenly as it had begun, the chaos ceased. The lights flickered back to life, revealing a scene of utter destruction. The living room was in shambles, furniture overturned, walls cracked and buckled. Roman lay unconscious, near the remnants of the circle. Stacy scrambled to check on him, relieved to find a pulse. But Ben was gone. "Ben," Stacy called, panic rising in her throat. "Ben, where are you?" Her only answer was the fading echo of Abby's laughter and the soft, mocking strains of the music box's melody. The séance had failed catastrophically, and in its wake it had left destruction, terror, and a chilling question: what had happened to Ben? Chapter 10. Possession. The aftermath of the séance left the house in eerie silence. Stacy paced the living room, her footsteps crunching on broken glass and splintered wood. Roman sat on the battered couch, holding an ice pack to his head, his usual composure shaken. "We have to find Ben," Stacy said for what felt like the 100th time. "He could be hurt, or—" She couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. The image of Ben's calm face before he vanished haunted her. What had he meant when he said he knew what he had to do? Roman's voice was grim when he spoke. "Stacy, we need to consider the possibility that Ben is no longer himself." Stacy whirled on him, anger flashing in her eyes. "What are you talking about?" "The entity we contacted," Roman explained, his voice heavy with regret. "It's powerful, far more so than I anticipated. And it seemed to have a particular interest in Ben." A chill ran down Stacy's spine as she remembered Abby's words. "A poor, broken Ben, so afraid, so alone. You think it possessed him," she whispered. Roman nodded slowly. "It's possible, and if that's the case, we need to be very careful. The Ben we find may not be the Ben we know." Before Stacy could respond, a low growl echoed from the hallway. They turned to see Duke, hackles raised, teeth bared in a snarl that neither of them had ever heard from the normally gentle dog. "Duke," Stacy called softly, taking a step towards him. "It's okay, boy, it's just us." But as she moved closer, she realized something was terribly wrong. Duke's eyes, usually a warm brown, now glowed with an eerie red light. His form seemed to ripple and shift, as if something beneath his skin was trying to break free. "Stacy, get back!" Roman shouted, but it was too late. With a sound that was half bark, half human scream, Duke lunged at Stacy. She threw up her arm instinctively, crying out as the dog's teeth sank into her flesh. Roman was there in an instant, pulling Duke off her with strength that belied his lean frame. As they struggled, Stacy stumbled back, clutching her bleeding arm. "Duke, stop!" she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Please, it's me." But the thing wearing Duke's form showed no sign of recognition. It thrashed in Roman's grip, foam flecking its muzzle, those unnatural red eyes fixed on Stacy with murderous intent. Roman began to chant, his voice rising above the cacophony of snarls and screams. The air around them seemed to thicken, shimmering with unseen energy. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Duke went limp in Roman's arms, the glow fading from his eyes. When they opened again, they were their normal warm brown, filled with confusion and fear. As Roman released him, Duke whimpered and crawled towards Stacy, tail tucked between his legs. She knelt beside him, her good arm wrapping around his neck as she buried her face in his fur. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "I'm so sorry." Roman helped Stacy to her feet, his face grim as he examined her wounded arm.
"This isn't just about Abby anymore," he said softly.
"The evil in this house, it's spreading, infecting everything it touches." As he spoke, a chill swept through the room. The temperature plummeted, their breath visible in small puffs of vapor. And then, carried on the cold air, came a voice. Ben's voice. "Stacy, help me!" Stacy's head snapped up, her eyes wide. Ben, where are you?" But Roman's grip on her arm tightened. "Wait," he warned. "It might be a trick." The voice came again, this time from a different direction. "Stacy, the attic, hurry." Without hesitation, Stacy broke free from Roman's grasp and bolted for the stairs, ignoring his shouts of warning. She took the steps 2 at a time, her heart pounding in her chest. The attic door stood open, a rectangle of darkness at the top of the stairs. As Stacy approached, she could hear something, a soft sound like crying. "Ben," she called softly, stepping into the gloom. "Are you here?" The crying grew louder, punctuated by hitching sobs. It sounded like a child. Like Abby. Stacy's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a small figure huddled in the corner. It was Abby, or at least the form of Abby that they had come to know. But something was different. The malevolence that usually radiated from her was gone, replaced by an aura of terror and grief. As Stacy's light fell on her, Abby looked up, her face streaked with tears. "I'm sorry," she whimpered. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Stacy approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at her to run. But something in Abby's eyes, something achingly human, made her pause. "What do you mean?" Stacy asked. "What happened?" Abby's form flickered, and for a moment Stacy saw not the ghostly child, but a real girl. A girl with fear in her eyes and blood on her hands. 1943, Abby whispered. It wasn't me. It was never me. But they used my name, my face. They made everyone think it was me. Realization dawned on Stacy, a horrifying understanding that made her blood run cold. The family murders, she breathed. It wasn't you. Abby shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. A girl did kill her family here, but it wasn't me. I died long before that. But the evil in this house, it took my form, used my pain, and now it has been. As Abby spoke, the attic around them began to change. The walls seemed to melt away, revealing scenes from the past. Stacy watched in horror as the tragedy of 1943 played out before her eyes. A young girl, driven mad by the whispers in the walls, a family, unaware of the danger lurking in their midst, and blood, so much blood, staining the floors and walls of the house they had thought was home. "Oh, God," Stacy whispered, her hand over her mouth. "What have we gotten ourselves into?" Abby's form began to fade, her voice growing fainter. "Find Ben," she pleaded. "Save him, before it's too late. Before he becomes like me, trapped forever." As Abby vanished, the attic returned to normal, but the chill in the air remained, along with the weight of the terrible knowledge Stacy now possessed. She turned to find Roman standing in the doorway, his face pale in the dim light. "You heard?" she asked. He nodded grimly. "Every word. The situation is worse than I feared. This house, it's not just haunted. It's a nexus of evil. A place where the barriers between worlds have worn thin." Stacy's mind raced, trying to process everything she had learned. But if Abby isn't behind all this, then what is? And where's Ben? Roman's eyes were dark with worry as he replied, "I don't know. But whatever has him, whatever's really controlling this house, I fear it's only just beginning to show its true power." As if in response to his words, a low, ominous rumble shook the house. The floorboards beneath their feet groaned and shifted, and from somewhere deep below they heard a sound. A laugh, Ben's laugh, but twisted, distorted, filled with a malevolent glee that sent shivers down Stacy's spine. The game, it seemed, had entered a new and terrifying phase, and Ben was at the center of it all. Chapter 11. The oak tree, the pale light of dawn, found Stacy and Roman in the kitchen, surrounded by an array of objects that looked more suited to an occult shop than a family home. Herbs tied in bundles, crystals of various colors and sizes, and vials of what Roman assured her were blessed oils covered every available surface. "Are you sure this will work?" Stacy asked, her voice hoarse from a sleepless night. The events in the attic had left her shaken. The revelation about Abby and the true nature of the evil in the house weighing heavily on her mind. Roman's face was grim as he continued his preparations. "I can't promise anything," he admitted, "but a cleansing ritual might at least give us a chance to weaken whatever's taken hold of Ben. And if we're lucky, it might drive the spirits out of the house long enough for us to figure out our next move." Stacy nodded, trying to ignore the trembling in her hands as she helped Roman gather the supplies. The absence of Ben's steady counting, the familiar rhythm that had been a constant backdrop to their lives, felt like a physical ache. As they worked, Duke whined softly from his spot in the corner. The dog hadn't left Stacy's side since the possession incident, as if trying to make amends for his involuntary attack. His presence was both a comfort and a stark reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. "Okay," Roman said finally, straightening up. "We'll start in the basement and work our way up. The goal is to drive any spirits or negative energy out of the house and into the open." "And then what?" Stacy asked. Roman's eyes flickered to the window where the gnarled branches of the old oak tree were just visible. "Then we confront whatever's out there." The cleansing ritual was unlike anything Stacy had ever experienced. Roman moved from room to room, burning sage and reciting incantations in a language Stacy didn't recognize. She followed behind, sprinkling salt in the corners and across thresholds. As they worked their way through the house, the air grew thick and heavy, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. Objects rattled on shelves, and more than once Stacy could have sworn she heard whispers just at the edge of hearing. But it wasn't until they reached the attic that things truly took a turn. The moment Roman stepped across the threshold, a howling wind tore through the space. Papers and small objects flew through the air, and the temperature plummeted so rapidly that frost began to form on the windows. "Hold your ground," Roman shouted over the cacophony, his voice strained with effort as he continued his chanting. Stacy gritted her teeth, forcing herself to keep moving, to keep sprinkling the salt despite the chaos around her. And then, cutting through the wind and the rattling and Roman's chanting, she heard a voice. "Stop! Please, stop!" It was Abby's voice, but not the malevolent tone they had come to associate with her presence. This was the voice of a frightened child, pleading and desperate. For a moment Stacy faltered, but Roman's hand on her arm steadied her. "Don't listen," he warned. "It's a trick." But even as he spoke, a figure began to materialize in the center of the attic. It was Abbey, but not as they had seen her before. This Abbey was solid, real, her face streaked with tears and her eyes wide with terror. "Please," she begged, reaching out towards Stacy. "You don't understand. You're making it angry. You're making it stronger." Roman's chanting grew louder, more insistent, and Abby's form began to flicker and fade. But as she disappeared, her final words echoed through the attic. "The tree! Remember the tree!" And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos ceased. The wind died down, the objects suspended in the air crashing to the floor. An eerie silence fell over the house. Roman sagged against the wall, his face pale with exertion. "It's done," he gasped. "Whatever was in the house, it's been driven out." Stacy moved to the window, peering out at the yard below. The old oak tree stood as it always had, its gnarled branches reaching towards the sky. But now, in the early morning light, she could see something moving among its leaves. Shadows that twisted and writhed in ways that defied natural law. "Roman," she called, her voice tight with fear. "Look!" He joined her at the window, his sharp intake of breath confirming what she saw. "My God," he whispered, "it's all of them. Every spirit, every bit of negative energy. It's all concentrated in that tree." As they watched, the shadows among the branches began to take form. Faces appeared and disappeared in rapid succession, men, women, children, all wearing expressions of anguish or rage. And at the center of it all, larger than the rest, was a face Stacy recognized from old photographs. "The headmistress," she breathed. Roman nodded grimly. "Millicent Grace, the one who hanged herself from that very tree in 1919. As if summoned by the mention of her name, the shadow of Millicent Grace seemed to turn towards them. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and suddenly Stacy found herself pulled into a vision of the past. She saw Millicent, younger and full of life, welcoming students to the boarding school. She saw Abbey among them, small and shy, but with a spark of mischief in her eyes. She saw late nights in Millicent's office, poring over strange books and whispering secrets that should have remained unspoken. And then she saw the horror. The ritual gone wrong. The thing they had summoned, dark and ancient and hungry. She felt Millicent's despair as she realized what she had done, what she had unleashed upon the innocent children in her care. She saw Abbey, brave little Abbey, trying to help, trying to send the darkness back. And she saw the moment it all went wrong, the moment the darkness took Abbey, twisted her, used her as a vessel for its evil. Finally, she saw Millicent's last desperate act. The climb up the oak tree, the rope around her neck. Her final thought, "I'm sorry, Abbey, I'm so sorry." Stacy came back to herself with a gasp, finding Roman's steadying hand on her shoulder. "What did you see?" he asked urgently. Through tears she hadn't realized she was shedding, Stacy recounted the vision. Roman's face grew graver with each word. "It's worse than I thought," he said when she had finished. "This isn't just a haunting. It's not even just an evil entity. It's corrupted. The headmistress's guilt, Abby's innocence, the fear and pain of every tragedy that's happened here, it's all been twisted together into something monstrous." "And now it has Ben," Stacy whispered, the full weight of the situation crashing down on her. As if in response to her words, a figure appeared at the base of the oak tree. Even from this distance, Stacy would recognize her brother anywhere, but the way he moved, the unnatural stillness of his posture, told her that, whatever was controlling Ben's body, it wasn't him. Ben's head tilted back, looking up at the window where they stood. And even though it should have been impossible at that distance, Stacy could have sworn she saw him smile. It was a terrible smile, full of malice and dark promise. And then, carried on a wind that seemed to come from nowhere, and everywhere at once, they heard Ben's voice. But it wasn't Ben speaking. It was the thing inside him, the darkness that had taken root in the house and now in her brother. "Come and play," it said, its tone a mockery of childish glee. "The game is just beginning." As the voice faded, the oak tree shuddered, its branches creaking and groaning. The faces in its leaves screamed silently, a chorus of anguish and rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Stacy turned to Roman, her face set with determination despite the fear that clawed at her heart. "What do we do now?" Roman's eyes were dark with worry as he replied, Now we prepare for battle, because whatever that thing is, whatever it's planning, I fear this is only the beginning of the true horror." As they turned away from the window, neither of them noticed the small dark figure that appeared briefly in the reflection. Abbey Grace, her eyes filled with sorrow, reached out as if to touch them, but her hand passed through the glass, insubstantial as smoke. "I'm sorry," her reflection mouthed silently. "I'm so sorry." And then she was gone, leaving only the ominous creaking of the oak tree and the weight of the battles yet to come. Chapter 12. Fractured minds. The house had become a labyrinth of shifting shadows and whispered fears. Stacy found herself lost in hallways that should have been familiar, rooms that seemed to stretch and contract with each blink of her eyes. Time itself felt fluid, hours bleeding into minutes, seconds expanding into eternity, but nothing compared to the horror of watching Ben's descent into madness. He had returned to the house after the incident at the oak tree, but the Ben who walked through the door was a fractured version of her brother. His movements were jerky, unpredictable, as if his body was a puppet controlled by inexperienced hands. His eyes, once warm and expressive, now held a feverish gleam that sent chills down Stacy's spine. 3 is safe, Ben muttered, his fingers twitching in that familiar counting rhythm. But now, instead of providing comfort, the repetition felt manic, desperate. 3 is right. 3 keeps the darkness out of sight. Stacy reached out to him, her heart breaking. "Ben, please, talk to me. Tell me how to help you." For a moment, something like recognition flickered in Ben's eyes, but it was quickly swallowed by that unnatural gleam. "Help!" He laughed, the sound high and brittle. "There is no help. There is only the game, and we must play. We must all play." As he spoke, the walls around them seemed to ripple, reality bending like a reflection in troubled water. Stacy stumbled, disoriented, and when she looked up, she found herself in a different room entirely. The kitchen, she realized, though it was hard to be sure. The appliances looked wrong somehow, twisted into shapes that defied logic. "Ben!" she called, her voice echoing strangely. "Ben, where are you?" A child's laughter answered her, high and cruel. For a heart-stopping moment, Stacy thought it was Abby, but when she turned, she saw Ben crouched in the corner, giggling into his hands like a schoolboy playing hide-and-seek. "Can't catch me," he sing-songed, his voice a disturbing mixture of his own and something younger, more sinister. "Can't save me. It's too late, Stacy. Too late for all of us." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving only the echo of his laughter behind. Stacy pressed her hands to her temples, trying to ground herself in reality. But what was reality in this nightmare house? "Roman!" she called out, desperate for any anchor to sanity. "Roman, where are you?" The house groaned around her, a sound like old bones shifting. And then, carried on a wind that shouldn't exist indoors, she heard Roman's voice. "The basement! Stacy, the basement! It's all connected." Without hesitation, Stacy ran for the basement door, but as she descended the stairs, each step seemed to take her further from her destination. The staircase stretched impossibly, the darkness at the bottom yawning wide like the maw of some great beast. When she finally reached the basement floor, what she saw stole the breath from her lungs. The basement had transformed into a vast cavern, its walls glistening with something that looked unsettlingly like living tissue. Pulsing veins of sickly light crisscrossed the floor and ceiling, converging on a central point where— "Oh, God!" Stacy whispered, her voice choked with horror. "Roman!" The medium was suspended in mid-air, tendrils of darkness wrapped around his limbs like cruel parodies of puppet strings. His eyes were open but unseeing, his mouth moving in silent screams. As Stacy watched, frozen in terror, shapes began to emerge from the walls. Faces pressed against the membranous surface, their features twisted in agony or rage. She recognized some of them from the photographs they'd found, students and teachers from the old boarding school. And there, larger than the rest, was the face of Millicent Grace, the head mistress who had started it all. "You shouldn't have come," Millicent's face spoke, her voice a cacophony of whispers. "This place, it's hungry." Always so hungry. "What is this place?" Stacy demanded, her voice shaking. "What's happening to Roman?" To Ben. The faces in the walls writhed, their expressions shifting from sorrow to anger to a terrible, gleeful madness. "This is the heart," they whispered in unison, "the heart of the house, the heart of the evil. We are all part of it now, and soon you will be too." A sound behind her made Stacy whirl around. Ben stood at the foot of the stairs, but he wasn't alone. Abbey Grace stood beside him, her small hand clasped in his. They both wore identical expressions of eerie calm. "It's time to play, Stacy," Ben said, his voice overlaid with Abby's childish tones. "Time to join the game." As they spoke, the tendrils holding Roman began to creep towards Stacy. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. "No," she said, shaking her head. "This isn't real. This can't be real." Ben and Abby tilted their heads in perfect unison, their smiles widening to impossible proportions. "Oh, but it is," they said. "It's the only real thing left." The basement began to shift and warp around them, the faces in the walls howling in a terrible chorus. Stacy felt the floor beneath her feet become unstable, reality itself seeming to unravel. As darkness closed in around her, Stacy clung to one thought, one desperate hope. This couldn't be the end. Somewhere, beneath the madness and the horror, her real brother still existed, and she would find him, no matter the cost. The last thing she saw before consciousness slipped away was Ben's face, a single tear tracking down his cheek. For just a moment she thought she saw a flicker of the brother she knew, trapped behind eyes that had seen too much, endured too much. Then darkness took her, and Stacy knew no more. Chapter 13. The mother's music consciousness returned to Stacy slowly, like bubbles rising through thick syrup. She found herself lying on the living room floor, the events in the basement a hazy, nightmarish memory. Had it all been a dream? But the ache in her muscles and the lingering chill in her bones told her otherwise. As her vision cleared, she saw Ben sitting cross-legged on the floor nearby, methodically arranging and rearranging a stack of yellowed papers. His movements were calmer now, more like his old self, but there was still something off about his eyes, a distant, glassy quality that made Stacy's heart clench. "Ben!" she called softly, pushing herself up to a sitting position. "Are you okay? He looked up at her, and for a moment Stacy saw a flicker of recognition in his gaze. But it was quickly subsumed by that eerie blankness. "The music isn't right," he said, his voice flat. "It needs to be in the right order. She says it has to be perfect." Stacy's brow furrowed. "She? Do you mean Abbey?" But Ben had already turned his attention back to the papers, muttering under his breath as he continued his obsessive organizing. Stacy crawled closer, careful not to startle him. As she neared, she realized what he was arranging. Sheet music, the paper brittle with age, covered in handwritten musical notation. "Ben, where did you get these?" she asked, reaching out to touch one of the pages. The moment her fingers made contact with the paper, a jolt of energy surged through her. The room around her blurred and shifted, and suddenly she was somewhere else entirely. A sunlit parlour, the air filled with the sound of a piano. A woman sat at the keys, her fingers dancing over the ivories with practiced grace. Beside her stood a small girl, Abbey, Stacy realized with a start. But this was Abbey as she must have been in life. Rosy-cheeked, eyes bright with joy as she watched her mother play. "Music has power, my darling," the woman was saying, her voice warm and rich. "It can soothe troubled minds, mend broken hearts. But in the wrong hands, it can also be used for darker purposes." Abbey nodded solemnly, but there was a glint in her eye that spoke of curiosity rather than fear. "Can you teach me, Mama? Can you teach me to use the music?" The woman's smile faltered for just a moment, a shadow passing over her face. "Perhaps, my love. But remember, with great power comes great responsibility. We must always be careful." The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving Stacy gasping on the living room floor. Ben was staring at her, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked, his voice a strange mix of childish wonder and something older, darker. "You saw the mother." Stacy nodded, her mind reeling. Abbey's mother. She was a musician. These pages, they're her compositions. Ben's face split into a grin that was decidedly unsettling.
"Yes, and they're the key to everything."
The mother knew, Abbey knew, and now we know too. As he spoke, the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began to creep across the windows, and the shadows in the corners seemed to deepen and writhe. And then, cutting through it all, came the sound of music. It started softly at first, a simple melody picked out on phantom piano keys, but it quickly grew in complexity and volume, filling the house with a symphony that was both beautiful and terrifying. Stacy could feel it in her bones, in the very air around her. It was alive somehow, pulsing with an energy that made her skin crawl. Objects began to move of their own accord, books flying off shelves, furniture scraping across the floor. And there, in the centre of the maelstrom, stood Ben. His eyes were closed, his hands moving as if conducting some invisible orchestra. The sheet music swirled around him in a vortex of paper and ink. "Ben!" Stacy shouted, trying to make herself heard over the cacophony. "Ben, stop! You don't know what you're doing!" But her words were lost in the music. As she watched in horror, Ben's feet began to lift off the ground. He hovered there, suspended in mid-air, a serene smile on his face even as chaos erupted around him. And then Stacy saw her, Abbey Grace, materializing like a heat haze next to Ben. But this wasn't the malevolent spirit they had encountered before. This Abbey looked solid, real, her face a mask of fear and desperation. "You have to stop him," Abbey cried, her voice somehow audible even over the deafening music. "The music, it's too powerful. It's tearing down the barriers between worlds." Stacy stumbled forward, fighting against the wind that howled through the room. "How?" she shouted back. "How do I stop it?" Abbey's form flickered as if she was struggling to maintain her presence. "The original song, the one my mother wrote. It's a lullaby. Find it. Play it. It's the only thing that can calm the storm." With a final desperate look, Abbey vanished. Stacy turned back to the swirling vortex of sheet music, her eyes scanning frantically for anything that looked like a lullaby. There, a page drifting past, the title barely legible. Abby's Lullaby. Stacy lunged for it, her fingers closing around the brittle paper. The moment she touched it, the music around her seemed to falter, like a record skipping. Ben's eyes snapped open, fixing on her with a gaze that was definitely not his own. "No," he snarled, his voice a chorus of 1,000 tortured souls. "The music is ours. The power is ours." But Stacy stood her ground. Taking a deep breath, she began to sing. Her voice was shaky at first, stumbling over the unfamiliar melody. But as she continued, she felt something shift in the air around her. The chaotic symphony began to quiet, overtaken by the simple, haunting notes of the lullaby. Ben's face contorted, a war of emotions playing across his features. He clutched at his head, a keening wail escaping his lips. "No, no, no," he moaned. "I don't want to go back. I don't want to be alone again." Stacy's heart broke at the pain in his voice, but she forced herself to keep singing. Slowly, ever so slowly, Ben began to descend. As his feet touched the ground, the maelstrom of objects and paper settled. The unnatural chill in the air dissipated, replaced by a warm, comforting glow. And then, just as the last notes of the lullaby faded, Ben collapsed. Stacy rushed to his side, gathering him in her arms. His eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were clear. They were Ben's eyes. "Stacy," he whispered, his voice hoarse. What happened? Where are we?" Tears of relief streamed down Stacy's face as she held her brother close. "You're back," she sobbed. "Oh, God, Ben, you're back." But even as joy flooded through her, Stacy couldn't shake the feeling that this was only a temporary reprieve. The sheet music lay scattered around them, a potent reminder of the power they had unwittingly unleashed. And somewhere in the house, she knew, the malevolent force that had possessed Ben was regrouping, planning its next move. The lullaby had brought a moment of peace, but the true battle, Stacy realized with a sinking heart, was far from over. Chapter 14, The Diary. The attic was silent save for the soft rustling of pages and the occasional creak of settling wood. Stacy sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, surrounded by boxes of old papers and books. Ben lay on a makeshift bed nearby, fitfully sleeping off the effects of his possession. She kept glancing at him, afraid that if she looked away for too long he might disappear again. In her lap lay a small leather-bound book, the Diary of Millicent Grace, headmistress of the ill-fated boarding school. Stacy had found it buried in a trunk of old-school records, its pages yellow with age and stained with what looked disturbingly like old bloodstains. With trembling fingers, she opened the diary to the first entry, August 15th, 1918. Today marks the beginning of a new chapter for Willow Creek School for Girls. The Board of Governors has entrusted me with the honourable position of headmistress. I vow to uphold the highest standards of education and moral guidance for the young ladies in my care. But I must confess, dear diary, that I have other, less public aspirations for my tenure here. This house, this land, they hold secrets. Ancient knowledge whispers in the walls, and I intend to listen. Stacy's brow furrowed as she read on. The early entries were innocuous enough. Daily reports on school activities, notes on particularly troublesome or promising students. But as the months progressed, a darker theme began to emerge. October 31st, 1918, I've made a breakthrough in my research. The symbols carved into the old oak tree. They're not random graffiti as I'd first assumed. They're a key, a cipher to unlock knowledge beyond mortal ken. I've begun transcribing them, but the work is slow. The girls must not suspect anything amiss. Young Abbey Grace has been watching me with curious eyes. Such a bright child, so full of potential. Perhaps, in time, she could be a valuable ally in my work.
Stacy's heart raced as she turned the pages, the entries becoming more frantic, more disturbing.
March 15th, 1919. The rituals are working. I can feel the power growing, pulsing beneath the floorboards. But it's not enough. The entity we've contacted demands more, always more. Abbey has been helping me, though I fear I've involved her too deeply. The poor child doesn't understand the forces we're dealing with. But her innocence, her purity, they make her the perfect conduit. God forgive me for what I must do. A chill ran down Stacy's spine. She glanced at Ben, relieved to see him still sleeping peacefully. Taking a deep breath, she turned to the final entry. May 1st, 1919. What have I done? Oh God, what have I done? The ritual went wrong. So terribly, terribly wrong. Abbey, sweet innocent Abbey. She tried to help, tried to send the darkness back. But it took her instead. Used her, broke her. I can still hear her screams. The other girls are hysterical. How can I explain? How can I possibly make this right? There's only one way to end this. To seal away the evil we've unleashed. I pray it will be enough. Forgive me, Abbey. Forgive me, all of you. I'm so sorry. The entry ended there, the rest of the pages blank. But as Stacy stared at the final words, something strange began to happen. The air around her shimmered like heat waves rising from hot pavement. The attic blurred and shifted, and suddenly she was somewhere else entirely. A classroom, dimly lit by flickering gas lamps. In the centre stood Millicent Grace, her face pale and drawn, dark circles under her eyes. Around her, a circle of young girls chanted in a language that made Stacy's ears hurt. And there, in the middle of it all, was Abbey Grace. She stood in a smaller circle, surrounded by strange symbols, drawn in what looked horribly like blood. Her eyes were wide with fear, her small body trembling. "Miss Grace," Abbey whimpered, "I'm scared. Can we stop now?" But Millicent's eyes were fever-bright, filled with a terrible hunger. "Just a little longer, dear. We're so close to understanding it all." The chanting grew louder, the air thick with an oily, sulphurous smell. And then, with a sound like reality itself tearing, something appeared in the room with them. Stacy couldn't look at it directly. It hurt her eyes, her mind to even try. But she saw its effect on Abbey. The poor girl screamed, a sound of pure terror and agony that Stacy knew would haunt her dreams. "No!" Millicent cried, realizing too late the horror she had unleashed. "Leave her alone! Take me instead!" But it was too late. The thing, the presence, engulfed Abbey. For a moment the girl's eyes met Stacy's across time and space. They were filled with pain, with betrayal, and with something else, a flicker of determination. And then Abbey was gone, leaving behind only a small, crumpled form on the classroom floor. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving Stacy gasping for air in the attic. She looked wildly around, half expecting to see the nightmare scene still playing out. But there was only dust and shadows and Ben's sleeping form. A soft sound drew her attention to the far corner of the attic. There, barely visible in the gloom, stood Abbey Grace. But this wasn't the malevolent spirit they had encountered before. This was the real Abbey, small, scared, and terribly, heartbreakingly young. "You saw," Abbey said, her voice echoing strangely. "You understand now." Stacy nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "It wasn't her fault," Abbey continued, her form flickering like a candle flame. "Not really. She didn't know what she was dealing with. None of us did." "The thing that took you," Stacy managed to ask, "is that what's in the house now? What's been tormenting us?" Abbey's face crumpled, tears spilling down her translucent cheeks. "Yes and no. It's changed, grown, fed on the fear and pain of everyone who's lived here since. It wears my face, uses my voice, but it's not me. Not anymore." She took a step closer, her eyes pleading. "You have to stop it, Stacy. You and Ben. You're the only ones who can. The music, my mother's music, it's the key. But be careful. It can save you, or it can doom you. It all depends on how you use it." Before Stacy could ask more, Abby's form began to fade. "Wait," Stacy cried. "How do we use the music? How do we stop this thing?" But Abbey was already gone, leaving behind only a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Trust your heart. And whatever happens, don't let it separate you. Together you're strong. Apart you'll fall." As the whisper faded, Ben stirred on his makeshift bed. Stacy quickly wiped away her tears, shoving the diary into her pocket. She had a feeling they'd need the information it contained before this was over. "Stacy," Ben mumbled, his eyes fluttering open. "What happened? Did I hurt anyone?" Stacy moved to his side, taking his hand in hers. "No, Ben. You're safe. We're safe. For now." But even as she spoke the words, Stacy couldn't shake the chill that had settled in her bones. The house creaked around them, a sound that seemed more menacing than ever before. And somewhere, in the depths of the building that had become their prison, she knew the true horror was waiting. The diary's revelations and Abby's warning echoed in her mind. Whatever came next, Stacy knew, would test them in ways they couldn't begin to imagine. But they would face it together. They had to. The alternative was too terrible to contemplate. Chapter 15, The Ritual. The living room had been transformed into a makeshift occult workshop. Candles flickered in a wide circle, their dancing flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the pungent scent of sage and other herbs Roman had insisted were essential for the ritual. Stacy stood at the edge of the circle, her heart pounding. The diary's revelations weighed heavily on her mind, but she pushed the doubts aside. They had to try something, anything, to free themselves and Ben from the house's malevolent influence. Ben sat in the center of the circle, his face pale but determined. The events of the past few days had taken their toll, but there was a new strength in his eyes, a resolve born of desperation. "Are you sure about this?" Stacy asked Roman, who was making final preparations for the ritual. The medium nodded grimly. "No, but we're out of options. If we can exorcise Abby's spirit, it might weaken the entity's hold on the house. And on Ben." As if on cue, a cold wind swept through the room, making the candles flicker dangerously. A child's laughter echoed from somewhere upstairs, high and cruel. "It knows," Ben whispered, his hands clenching into fists. "It's trying to stop us." Roman took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "Then we'd better begin. Remember, no matter what happens, do not break the circle. The consequences could be severe." With that ominous warning, he began to chant in a language Stacy didn't recognize. The words seemed to hang in the air, vibrating with an otherworldly power. As the chant grew louder, the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost crept across the windows, forming intricate alien patterns. Ben gasped, his back arching as if in pain. "I can feel it," he gritted out. "It's fighting." Stacy took a step forward, instinctively reaching for her brother, but Roman's sharp glance stopped her. "The circle," he reminded her. "We can't break it." The chanting reached a fever pitch, and suddenly the air in the center of the circle began to shimmer and twist. A form took shape, a small girl in an old-fashioned dress, her face hidden by a curtain of dark hair. "Abby!" Stacy breathed. The figure raised its head, and Stacy's blood ran cold. This wasn't the scared, innocent Abbey she had seen in her vision. The face that looked back at them was a mask of malevolence, its eyes burning with an inhuman light. "Fools!" it hissed, its voice a discordant mix of child and ancient evil. "Did you think your pathetic ritual could banish me? I am beyond your comprehension, beyond your power." Roman's chanting faltered for a moment, but he pressed on, his voice strained with effort. The entity wearing Abby's form writhed and twisted, its shape blurring at the edges. For a moment it seemed to be working. The entity's form began to fade, becoming translucent. But then, with a sound like reality tearing, everything went horribly wrong. A shockwave of energy burst from the entity, shattering the circle of candles and sending Roman flying across the room. He hit the wall with a sickening thud and crumpled to the floor unconscious. "Roman!" Stacy cried, torn between helping him and staying with Ben. But Ben was beyond help. He levitated off the ground, suspended in mid-air as dark tendrils of energy coiled around him. His eyes rolled back in his head, and when he spoke, it was with a voice that wasn't his own. "Did you really think you could cast me out?" The entity sneered through Ben's mouth. "I am this house. I am the pain and suffering of every soul that has ever dwelt here, and now I am your brother." Stacy watched in horror as Ben's features began to shift and change, becoming a grotesque blend of her brother and something other. The walls of the house groaned and creaked, expanding and contracting like a giant hungry maw. "Ben, fight it!" Stacy pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "You're stronger than this thing, I know you are." For a moment, Ben's true self seemed to surface. His eyes cleared, focusing on Stacy with a look of desperate determination. "Stacy," he gasped. "The door. We have to. Get out." The entity roared in fury and Ben's body contorted in pain, but his words had sparked something in Stacy's mind. The door. Freedom. They had to leave the house. With a sudden, horrible clarity, Stacy understood what she had to do. She lunged for Ben, grabbing his arm and pulling with all her might. "Come on!" she shouted. "We're getting out of here!" The house itself seemed to fight them, the floor buckling and writhing beneath their feet. Furniture flew across the room, smashing against walls. But Stacy didn't let go, dragging her brother toward the front door with single-minded determination. Ben struggled, alternating between fighting against her and fighting against the entity possessing him. "I can't," he moaned. "Stacy, I can't go outside. You know I can't." "You have to," Stacy insisted, her voice breaking. "It's the only way. Remember what Abbey said. Together we're strong. We have to do this together." They reached the door, and Stacy fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking. Behind them, the living room was being torn apart, a maelstrom of flying objects and shattering glass. Finally, the door swung open. Fresh air and sunlight poured in, a stark contrast to the nightmare they were leaving behind. But Ben balked at the threshold, his old fears resurging. "I can't," he whispered, trembling. "Stacy, I'm scared." Stacy turned to face him, gripping his shoulders tightly. "I know you're scared," she said, "but you're not alone. I'm right here with you. We'll do it together, okay? On 3. 1, 2, 3. With a final desperate push, they stumbled out onto the porch. The moment they crossed the threshold, an unearthly shriek filled the air. The house seemed to convulse, windows shattering outward in a spray of glass. Ben collapsed to his knees on the grass, gasping for air. His eyes were clear now, free of the entity's influence. Stacy knelt beside him, pulling him into a fierce embrace. "You did it," she sobbed. "Oh God, Ben, you did it. You're okay." For a long moment they simply held each other, shaking with relief and residual terror. But their reprieve was short-lived. From within the house came a low, ominous rumble. The ground began to tremble beneath them. Stacy looked up to see dark, roiling clouds gathering above the house. Bolts of unnatural lightning arced between the windows, and a wind that smelled of grave dirt and ancient evil whipped around them. "It's not over," Ben said, his voice hoarse. "We stopped it for now, but it's angry," Stacy finished. "And it's only going to get stronger." They looked at each other, the weight of their situation settling heavily upon them. They had won a small victory, but the true battle was far from over. The entity that possessed the house was still there, waiting, growing in power. And somewhere inside, Roman was still unconscious, trapped with the very evil they had failed to exorcise. As the storm of supernatural energy raged around the house, Stacy helped Ben to his feet. They clung to each other, facing the nightmare that had become their home. "What do we do now?" Ben asked, his voice small and scared. Stacy squared her shoulders, drawing on a well of strength she didn't know she possessed. "We fight," she said firmly. "We find a way to end this once and for all, for Abbey, for Roman, for us. We fight." The house loomed before them, a monolith of malevolence. But as terrifying as it was, Stacy felt a glimmer of hope. They had faced their fears, overcome impossible odds, and they had done it together. Whatever came next, whatever horrors the entity had in store for them, they would face it as one. It was their only chance, their only hope. The true battle was about to begin. Chapter 16. Descent. The basement door loomed before them, a yawning maw of darkness that seemed to breathe with malevolent life. Stacy's hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, the cold metal sending a shiver through her body. Ben stood close behind her, his breathing quick and shallow. "We don't have to do this," Ben whispered, his voice tight with fear. "We could just leave. Forget about all of this." Stacy shook her head, steeling herself. "We can't abandon Roman, and we can't let this evil continue. We have to end it." With a deep breath, she turned the knob and pulled the door open. The hinges creaked ominously, the sound echoing in the too-quiet house. A rush of cold, damp air washed over them, carrying with it the scent of mould and something else, something old and rotten. "Stay close," Stacy murmured, flicking on her flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing steep stairs that disappeared into inky blackness. They descended slowly, each step creaking under their weight. Ben's fingers twitched at his sides, his lips moving in a silent count. 3 steps, pause, 3 more, pause. The familiar rhythm seemed to calm him, if only slightly. As they reached the bottom, Stacy's flashlight beam swept across the basement. What they saw made them both gasp in horror. The walls pulsed with an unhealthy organic light, veins of sickly luminescence spreading like a web across every surface. The floor was slick with something that looked disturbingly like black ichor, and there, in the center of it all, suspended in mid-air, was Roman. The medium's body hung limp, dark tendrils of energy wrapped around his limbs like cruel puppet strings. His eyes were open but unseeing, his mouth moving in silent screams. "Oh, God!" Ben choked out. "What do we do?" Before Stacy could respond, a chorus of whispers filled the air. The shadows in the corners began to move, coalescing into vaguely human shapes. As they watched in terrified fascination, the shapes became more defined, revealing the ghostly forms of men, women, and children, all victims of the house's long and bloody history. One spirit stepped forward, her form more solid than the others. Stacy recognized her from the old photographs, Abbey Grace, the headmistress who had started it all. "You shouldn't have come," Millicent's voice echoed, a cacophony of whispers. "This place, it's hungry. Always so hungry." "We've come for our friend," Stacy said, trying to keep her voice steady, "and to end this once and for all." The spirits stirred restlessly, their whispers growing louder. Millicent's face twisted in a grimace of pain and regret. "You don't understand. None of us understood, not until it was too late. The evil here is beyond anything you can imagine." As she spoke, the tendrils holding Roman began to pulse with dark energy. The medium's body convulsed, a scream finally tearing from his throat. The sound was inhuman, filled with agony and despair. "Roman!" Stacy cried, rushing forward. But as she neared him, an invisible force slammed into her, sending her flying across the room. She hit the wall hard, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. "Stacy!" Ben shouted, torn between helping his sister and facing the encroaching spirits. Stacy struggled to her feet, her vision blurring. Something warm trickled down the side of her face, blood. As she wiped it away, she felt a strange sensation creeping through her body, a coldness that seemed to seep into her very bones. "Ben!" she gasped, her voice sounding distant and strange to her own ears. "Something's wrong. I feel different." Ben turned to her, his eyes widening in horror. "Stacy, your eyes!" "They're changing." Before she could ask what he meant, a searing pain shot through her head. Images flashed before her eyes, memories that weren't her own. She saw the house as it had been over the decades, witnessed the countless tragedies that had unfolded within its walls. And through it all, she felt the presence of something ancient and malevolent, watching, waiting, feeding on the pain and fear of its victims. "No," Stacy whimpered, clutching her head. "Get out of my mind." The spirits surged forward, their whispers becoming a deafening roar. Ben found himself surrounded, ghostly hands reaching for him from all sides. He closed his eyes, his lips moving faster now. 3 is safe, 3 is right, 3 keeps the darkness out of sight. As Ben's mantra grew louder, something unexpected happened. A ripple of energy emanated from him, pushing the spirits back. For a moment the basement fell silent. Then, cutting through the quiet, came a child's laugh. High and cruel, it sent shivers down their spines. "Oh, poor broken Ben," the voice sing-songed. It was Abby's voice, but twisted wrong. "Your little tricks won't save you here. This is my domain, my playground." The floor beneath their feet began to shift and buckle. Walls stretched and contorted, the room expanding impossibly. In the chaos, Stacy found herself being pulled away from Ben, drawn deeper into the writhing shadows. "Ben!" she screamed, reaching out for her brother. But it was too late. The darkness swallowed her, and she was falling into an abyss that seemed to have no end. The last thing she heard before losing consciousness was Ben's voice, desperate and fading. "Stacy!" "Hold on. I'll find you, I promise." Then there was only darkness, and the echoing laughter of a child who was no longer a child at all. In the depths of the basement, now transformed into a nightmarish labyrinth, Ben stood alone. Roman hung suspended above him, the spirits of the house's victims swirled around him, and somewhere in the darkness, his sister was lost and in danger. With trembling hands, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled sheet of music, Abby's lullaby. It was the only weapon he had left. "Hold on, Stacy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm coming for you. We'll face this together. We have to." As he began to hum the haunting melody, the house seemed to hold its breath. The true test was about to begin, and the stakes couldn't be higher. For Stacy, for Roman, for all the lost souls trapped in this place of horror, Ben knew he had to be strong. He had to fight. It was time to face the darkness head-on. Chapter 17, the sisters' arrival. The sound of tires on gravel cut through the oppressive silence that had fallen over the house. Stacy, who had been hovering anxiously by the window since her return from the basement, felt her heart leap into her throat. A sleek black car had pulled up in front of the house, its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. "Ben!" she called, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Someone's here!" Ben appeared at her side, his face pale and drawn. The ordeal in the basement had left its mark on both of them, but Ben seemed to have aged years in a matter of hours. "Who is it?" he asked, peering out into the gloom. As if in answer to his question, a figure emerged from the car. Tall, confident, with a shock of red hair that caught the fading light. Stacy felt her breath catch in her throat. "Sarah," she whispered. "It's Sarah." Ben's fingers began their familiar tapping rhythm against his thigh. "Why is she here?" "We told her not to come." Before Stacy could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the house. For a moment neither of them moved, as if frozen in place by the sudden intrusion of normality into their nightmare. Another knock, more insistent this time. "Stacy, Ben, I know you're in there. Open up." Exchanging a glance, Stacy and Ben moved to the door. Stacy's hand hovered over the knob, trembling slightly. What if opening the door let more than just Sarah in? But they couldn't leave her out there, not with what they knew was lurking in the shadows. Taking a deep breath, Stacy opened the door. Sarah stood on the porch, one eyebrow raised in a mixture of concern and exasperation. "Finally," she said, brushing past Stacy into the house. "I was beginning to think you two had. My God!" Her voice trailed off as she took in the state of the living room. Overturned furniture, shattered glass, and the lingering smell of smoke from Roman's failed ritual. Sarah turned to her siblings, her eyes wide with shock. "What the hell happened here?" she demanded. "Are you both okay?" Stacy and Ben exchanged a look. How could they possibly explain? "It's complicated," Stacy began, but Sarah cut her off. "Complicated. It looks like a war zone in here. And you too." She gestured at their dishevelled appearance, the dark circles under their eyes. "You look terrible. What's going on?" Ben's tapping had increased in speed and intensity. "You shouldn't have come," he muttered. "It's not safe here." Sarah's expression softened. She reached out to Ben, but he flinched away from her touch. "Ben, honey, I'm worried about you. Both of you, after Mom's death." "Don't," Stacy said sharply. "Don't bring Mom into this." A tense silence fell over the room. Sarah looked between her siblings, confusion and hurt warring on her face. "I don't understand," she said softly. "I'm just trying to help." As if triggered by her words, a cold wind swept through the room. The temperature plummeted, and in the corners of the room, shadows began to writhe and dance. "No," Stacy breathed, her eyes wide with fear. "Not now. Please, not now." Sarah spun around, trying to locate the source of the sudden chill. "What was that? What's happening?" And then they heard it. A child's laughter, high and cruel, echoing through the house. "Oh, poor Sarah," the voice sing-songed. It was Abby's voice, but twisted wrong. "So concerned, so caring. But you don't know the truth, do you? About what really happened to Mommy dearest?" Sarah went pale, her hand flying to her mouth. "Who? What is that?" But Stacy and Ben were focused on Abby's words. "What do you mean?" Stacy called out, her voice shaking. "What truth?" The laughter grew louder, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Shall I tell them, Sarah? Shall I tell them how Mommy didn't just die, how she was pushed?" "No," Sarah whispered, her face a mask of horror. "That's not. I didn't mean to." Ben turned to Sarah, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Sarah, what is it talking about?" Tears were streaming down Sarah's face now. "It was an accident," she sobbed. "Mom and I were arguing at the top of the stairs. She was drunk, furious that I wanted to move out. I just pushed her away. I didn't mean for her to fall. I swear I didn't mean it." The revelation hit Stacy and Ben like a physical blow. They staggered back, staring at their sister as if seeing her for the first time. "You killed her," Stacy whispered, her voice barely audible. "All this time you let us think." "I'm sorry," Sarah cried, reaching out to them. "I'm so sorry. I wanted to tell you, but I was scared. I didn't know how." But her words were drowned out by Abby's laughter, which had risen to a deafening pitch. The house itself seemed to shake with the force of it. "Oh, what delicious pain," Abby's voice crooned. "What exquisite betrayal. Can you feel it, Sarah? Can you feel how your secret has poisoned everything it touched?" As she spoke, tendrils of darkness began to creep across the floor, reaching for Sarah's feet. "No!" Ben shouted, lunging forward to pull Sarah away, but as his hand closed around her arm, a jolt of energy passed between them. Ben cried out in pain, stumbling back. "Ben!" Stacy moved to help him, but found her way blocked by a wall of shimmering air. She pounded against it, but it was like hitting solid steel. "Ben, Sarah!"
The siblings found themselves separated, each trapped in a bubble of energy that pulsed with malevolent light.
And there, in the center of the room, a figure began to take shape. Abbey Grace, or the thing wearing her form, materialized before them. Her eyes glowed with an unholy light, and her smile was full of sharp, gleaming teeth. "And now," she said, her voice a terrible mixture of child and ancient evil, "now we can begin the real game. 3 siblings, 3 secrets, 3 souls ripe for the taking. Who will break first, I wonder? Who will betray the others to save themselves?" As the entity's laughter filled the room, Stacy, Ben and Sarah looked at each other across the divides that separated them. The truth of their mother's death hung between them like a physical presence, a wound that might never heal. And in that moment, as the house's evil prepared to play its cruelest game yet, they all realized the same terrible truth. They were no longer fighting just to survive. They were fighting for their very souls. The true test of their bond was about to begin. Chapter 18, Shattered Reality. The world twisted and warped around Stacy as she stumbled through what had once been familiar hallways. The house had become a nightmare labyrinth, defying all logic and physics. Walls stretched and contracted, doors led to impossible places, and staircases spiraled into infinity. "Ben!" she called out, her voice echoing strangely in the ever-shifting space. "Sarah!" But there was no answer, only the mocking laughter of Abbey Grace seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Stacy turned a corner and found herself in what appeared to be the kitchen, but everything was wrong. The appliances were melted and distorted, dripping like wax. The floor beneath her feet undulated like waves on a stormy sea. A figure stood at the sink, its back to Stacy. With a jolt of recognition, she realized it was her mother. "Mom," Stacy whispered, her heart pounding. The figure turned, and Stacy had to bite back a scream. It wore her mother's face, but the eyes were hollow sockets, weeping black ichor. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. "Why didn't you save me, Stacy?" The thing that wasn't her mother asked, its voice a terrible rasp. "Why did you let me die?" Stacy stumbled backward, shaking her head frantically. "No," she gasped. "You're not real. This isn't real." The creature lunged for her, its arms elongating grotesquely. Stacy turned and ran, bursting through a door that hadn't been there a moment before. She found herself in a long corridor lined with mirrors, but the reflection showed not her own face, but scenes from her past. Moments of anger, of jealousy, of petty cruelty. Every mistake, every regret, played out in excruciating detail. "Stop it," Stacy pleaded, squeezing her eyes shut. "Please, stop." "Oh, but don't you want to see?" Abby's voice whispered in her ear. "Don't you want to know the truth about yourself?" Meanwhile, in another part of the twisted house, Ben was facing his own nightmares. The room he found himself in was a perfect cube, every surface covered in intricate, ever-changing patterns. The symmetry was maddening, the complexity overwhelming. Ben's breath came in short, sharp gasps. His fingers twitched at his sides, desperate to count, to organize, to control something in this chaos. "3 is safe," he muttered, his voice shaking. 3 is right. 3 keeps the darkness out of sight. As he spoke, something strange began to happen. The patterns on the walls started to align, forming orderly sequences of 3s. The room seemed to stabilize, the maddening shift slowing. "No!" Abby's voice shrieked, filled with frustration. "That's not how this works." But Ben pressed on, his voice growing stronger. 3 by 3 by 3, order from chaos, light from dark. With each repetition, the room became more solid, more real. The patterns settled into a soothing, rhythmic dance of 3s. In her own hell of shifting realities, Sarah fought against a tide of guilt and regret. She stood in a mockery of their childhood home, surrounded by accusing faces. Her siblings, her father, her mother, all staring at her with eyes full of betrayal. "I'm sorry," Sarah sobbed, sinking to her knees. "I never meant for any of this to happen." "But it did happen, didn't it?" Abby's voice cooed, sickly sweet. "You killed your mother. You tore your family apart. And now you've led them all into my web." Sarah looked up, her tear-stained face hardening with sudden resolve. "No," she said, her voice low but firm. "I made a terrible mistake, but I won't let you use it to destroy us." She stood facing the phantoms of her family. "I love you," she said, "all of you, and I'm so sorry, but I won't let this thing win." As she spoke, the accusing faces began to soften, to fade. The twisted version of their home started to dissolve around her. In the heart of the house, Abbey Grace screamed in fury. The walls shook, reality itself seeming to buckle under the force of her rage. "You can't resist me," she howled. "This is my domain, my game." But even as she raged, the siblings were fighting back. Ben's orderly chants, Stacy's determined steps through the corridor of mirrors, Sarah's heartfelt apologies, all of it was having an effect. The house groaned and shifted, the impossible geometries beginning to collapse in on themselves. Walls crumbled, floors buckled, and suddenly the siblings found themselves back in the living room where it had all began. They rushed to each other, embracing tightly, tears streaming down their faces. "I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered, clinging to her brother and sister, "for everything." "We know," Stacy said softly. "We forgive you." Ben nodded, his arms tightening around his sisters. "We're family," he said. "That's what matters." Their moment of reunion was shattered by a howl of inhuman rage. Abbey Grace materialized before them, her form flickering and distorting. Gone was any pretense of the innocent child. Now she was a writhing mass of shadow and malice, eyes burning with eldritch fire. "You think your pathetic family bonds can save you," she snarled. "You know nothing of true power, of true hunger. I am ancient beyond your comprehension, and I will not be denied." The house shuddered around them, darkness seeping from every crack and crevice. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with malevolent energy. But the siblings stood their ground, hands clasped tightly together. "We're not afraid of you," Stacy said, her voice steady despite her fear. "We're stronger together," Sarah added, squeezing her siblings' hands. Ben's voice joined theirs, steady and sure. "And we will not let you win." As they spoke, a warm light began to emanate from their joined hands, pushing back the encroaching darkness. Abbey Grace screamed, a sound of fury and, was that fear? For a moment, hope flared in the siblings' hearts. But then Abby's form began to grow, to expand, filling the room with suffocating darkness. "You want to play?" Her voice boomed, shaking the very foundations of the house. "Then let's play. But remember, in my game, the stakes are your souls. And I never lose." As the darkness closed in around them, Stacy, Ben and Sarah clung to each other, their bond the only light in the overwhelming shadow. They had faced their personal demons and emerged stronger, but now they faced something far more ancient, far more terrible. The final battle was about to begin, and none of them knew if they would survive it. Chapter 19, The Possession of Stacy.
The darkness that had engulfed the siblings began to recede, but the reprieve was short-lived.
As the shadows peeled back, Stacy suddenly doubled over, a scream of agony tearing from her throat. "Stacy!" Ben and Sarah cried in unison, reaching for their sister. But before they could touch her, Stacy's body went rigid. She slowly straightened, and when she turned to face them, her eyes were no longer her own. They were black, bottomless pits that seemed to swallow all light. "Oh, this is delicious," Stacy's mouth said, but the voice was Abby's, a discordant mix of childish glee and ancient malevolence. "Such a strong vessel, so much fear, so much love, it will sustain me for eons." Ben took a step forward, his hand outstretched. "Stacy, fight it. I know you're in there." Stacy's head tilted at an unnatural angle, a cruel smile twisting her features. "Stacy's not home right now, Ben, but don't worry, I'll take good care of her body."
Sarah moved to stand beside Ben, her face pale but determined.
"Let her go, you monster. Haven't you taken enough from us?" A laugh bubbled up from Stacy's throat, harsh and grating. "Taken enough? Oh, you foolish girl! I've only just begun." With a wave of her hand, Stacy sent Ben and Sarah flying across the room. They slammed into the wall, the impact knocking the breath from their lungs. "Now," Stacy purred, stalking towards them with predatory grace, "let's see how much pain these bonds of family can endure before they snap." She raised her hand, dark energy crackling at her fingertips. But before she could strike, a furious bark echoed through the room. Duke, who had been cowering in a corner, forgotten in the chaos, suddenly leapt into action. The German shepherd launched himself at Stacy, his teeth sinking into her arm. She howled in pain and fury, trying to shake him off. "Duke, no!" Ben cried, struggling to his feet. Stacy finally managed to dislodge the dog, flinging him across the room. Duke hit the floor with a yelp, but quickly scrambled back up, placing himself between the possessed Stacy and the other siblings. "Loyal to the last," Abbey Stacy sneered. "But loyalty won't save you here." She began to chant in a language that hurt to hear, the words seeming to twist reality around them. The air grew thick and heavy, and Duke whimpered, his form beginning to flicker and distort. "Stop it!" Sarah shouted, her voice breaking. "Leave him alone." But Abbey Stacy only laughed, the sound sending chills down their spines. "Why should I? His pain, his fear, it's exquisite. Almost as delicious as yours will be when I'm done with him." Ben, however, wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on Duke, watching as the dog's form continued to waver. And then, in a moment of clarity, he understood. "Duke," he called softly, kneeling down to the dog's level. "It's okay, boy. You can let go now. We'll be all right." Duke turned to look at Ben, and for a moment his form solidified. His eyes, warm and brown and so full of love, met Ben's. Then, with a final soft woof, Duke leapt at Abbey Stacy. But this time, instead of attacking, the dog seemed to dissolve into pure light. The radiance engulfed Abbey Stacy, who screamed in agony and rage. For a brief moment, Stacy's true self surfaced. "Ben, Sarah," she gasped, her eyes clearing. "Help me!" "Stacy." They rushed forward, but before they could reach her, Abbey reasserted control.
No, the entity howled.
"This vessel is mine." The light that had been Duke began to fade, absorbed into Stacy's body. But as it did, something changed. The malevolent energy surrounding her seemed to weaken, as if Duke's sacrifice had created a crack in Abbey's control. Ben seized the opportunity. Remembering the lullaby, he began to sing, his voice shaky at first, but growing stronger with each note. "Sleep, my child, and peace attend thee, all through the night." Sarah joined in, her clear voice twining with Ben's. "Guardian angels God will send thee all through the night." Abbey Stacy writhed, her hands clutching her head. "Stop it!" she shrieked. "I won't go back to the darkness." "I won't be alone again." But the siblings pressed on, their voices rising in harmony. "Soft the drowsy hours are creeping, hill and dale in slumber sleeping, I my loving vigil keeping all through the night." As the last notes faded, Stacy's body went limp, collapsing to the floor. Ben and Sarah rushed to her side, cradling her between them. "Stacy," Sarah called softly, brushing hair from her sister's face. "Can you hear us?" For a long, terrible moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, Stacy's eyes fluttered open. They were her own eyes again, filled with exhaustion and pain, but blessedly, beautifully human. "Ben, Sarah," she whispered. "What? What happened?" They pulled her into a tight embrace, tears streaming down their faces. "You're back," Ben choked out. "Oh God, Stacy, you're back." As they held each other, the house seemed to settle around them. The oppressive energy that had filled the air began to dissipate, leaving behind a sense of fragile peace. But even as relief washed over them, a cold certainty settled in their hearts. This wasn't over. Abbey Grace had been driven back but not defeated, and the cost, Duke's sacrifice, weighed heavily upon them all. Stacy pulled back slightly, her eyes searching the room. "Where's Duke?" she asked, her voice small and scared. Ben and Sarah exchanged a pained look. How could they explain? Before they could find the words, a soft whine echoed through the room. They turned to see a shimmering outline in the corner, the ghostly form of a German shepherd, wagging its tail. "Duke," Stacy breathed, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. The spectral dog padded over to them, nuzzling each sibling in turn before fading away, leaving behind a sense of warmth and love. For a moment they sat in silence, honouring Duke's sacrifice. Then, with a shared look of determination, they helped each other to their feet. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. Stacy took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "Now, we end this. For Duke, for us, for everyone this house has ever hurt. We find a way to stop Abbey Grace, once and for all. Ben nodded, his jaw set. "Together," he said firmly. As one, they turned to face the rest of the house. The battle wasn't over, but they were no longer fighting alone. They had each other. They had the memory of Duke's bravery, and they had a newfound strength born of love and sacrifice. Whatever Abbey Grace threw at them next, they would face it as a family. And this time, they vowed, they would emerge victorious, no matter the cost. Chapter: The Headmistress's Secret. The attic was eerily quiet, the air thick with dust and unspoken dread. Stacy, Ben, and Sarah huddled around an old trunk they had discovered tucked away in a corner. Its lock had long since rusted away, leaving its contents vulnerable to their desperate search for answers. "There has to be something here," Stacy muttered, rifling through stacks of yellowed papers. "Something to explain why the headmistress did what she did." Ben's fingers twitched at his sides, his eyes darting nervously around the shadowy space. "What if we don't like what we find?" he whispered. Sarah placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "We need the truth, Ben, no matter how ugly it might be." As if in response to her words, Stacy's hand closed around a small leather-bound book. "I think this is it," she breathed, carefully opening the fragile diary. The headmistress's personal journal. The siblings leaned in close as Stacy began to read aloud, her voice trembling slightly. "May 1st, 1919, what have I done? The ritual was a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable mistake. I thought I could control it, harness its power for the good of the school. But I was a fool. Abbey Grace, that poor, sweet child. She trusted me, and I betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. The entity we summoned, it was never meant to inhabit our world, and now it has taken her, twisted her into something unrecognizable. The other girls are terrified. They don't understand what's happening, and how could they? I've unleashed a horror beyond comprehension upon them all. There's only one way to end this, to seal the evil away and protect what remains of my students, my life for theirs. It's a small price to pay for my arrogance. To whoever finds this, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. And please, whatever you do, don't let them forget Abbey Grace. Remember her as she was, not as what she's become." Stacy's voice trailed off, the weight of the headmistress's words settling heavily upon them. "She sacrificed herself," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with realization. She knew her death would bind the entity to the house. Ben shook his head, his brow furrowed in confusion. "But why? Why would her death have that kind of power?" As if in answer to his question, a chill swept through the attic. The temperature plummeted, their breath visible in small puffs of vapor. And then, materializing before them like a heat haze, appeared the translucent form of Millicent Grace, the headmistress herself. "Because, dear child," Millicent's ghost said, her voice echoing strangely, "a willing sacrifice holds tremendous power, especially when that sacrifice is born of true remorse." Stacy stepped forward, her heart pounding. "You've been here all this time, watching everything that's happened." Millicent nodded, sorrow etched into her ethereal features. "Bound to this house just as Abbey is. But where she became a vessel for the entity's malevolence, I became its jailer. My death created a barrier, keeping the evil contained within these walls. But it's breaking free," Ben said, his voice shaking. "We've seen it, felt it. It's getting stronger." "Yes," Millicent sighed. "The barrier weakens with each passing year, with each new tragedy that occurs here. The entity feeds on pain, on fear, and it has had decades to gorge itself." Sarah's eyes narrowed, a spark of defiance igniting within her. "There has to be a way to stop it, to end this once and for all." Millicent's form flickered, her expression grave. "There is, but the cost. It may be more than you're willing to pay." "Tell us," Stacy demanded, her voice steady despite her fear. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." The headmistress's ghost seemed to gather herself, her next words carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. "The entity can be banished, sent back to the void from whence it came. but it requires a sacrifice equal to the one that bound it here, a life freely given by one who truly understands the horror they face. The siblings exchanged looks of shock and dismay. Ben was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "One of us would have to die." Millicent nodded solemnly. "Not just die, willingly give their life with full knowledge of what they're facing. It's the only way to generate enough power to tear the entity from Abbey and cast it out." A heavy silence fell over the attic, broken only by the faint, ghostly weeping of long-dead students echoing through the walls. The true cost of ending the nightmare was now brutally clear. Stacy's mind raced, piecing together everything they had learned. "The music," she said suddenly, turning to her siblings. "Abby's mother's music. It has power. We've seen it. Could we use that somehow?" Millicent's eyes widened, a glimmer of hope lighting her spectral features. Yes, that might work. Music has always been a conduit for great power. If you could harness it, combine it with the sacrifice, it might be enough to tip the scales in your favor. "But who—" Sarah began, only to be cut off by a bone-chilling laugh that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Oh, my dear children," Abbey Grace's voice crooned, dripping with malice, "do you really think I'd let you destroy me so easily? I've waited too long, fed too well. This house is mine, and soon your souls will be too." The attic began to shake, dust and debris raining down around them. Millicent's form flickered violently, her voice becoming urgent. "You must decide quickly. The entity knows what you're planning. It will do everything in its power to stop you." As if to emphasize her point, the floor beneath their feet began to buckle and warp. Cracks spider-webbed across the walls, and a howling wind tore through the space, scattering papers and upending furniture. "We have to get out of here," Sarah shouted, grabbing Ben's arm and pulling him towards the attic door. Stacy snatched up the headmistress's diary and a handful of sheet music before following her siblings. As they raced down the stairs, the house groaned and shifted around them, its very structure seeming to come alive with malevolent intent. They burst into the living room, panting and wild-eyed. The relative calm of the space was a stark contrast to the chaos they'd just fled, but they knew it was only temporary. Abbey Grace's laughter still echoed through the house, a constant reminder of the evil that surrounded them. "What do we do now?" Ben asked, his voice trembling as he sank onto the couch. Stacy clutched the diary and music sheets to her chest, her mind racing. "We prepare," she said firmly. "We study these, learn everything we can about the music's power and the nature of the sacrifice. And then," she trailed off, the weight of what they were facing settling heavily upon her shoulders. Sarah finished the thought for her, determination blazing in her eyes. "And then we end this, once and for all." As the siblings huddled together, the house creaked and groaned around them. In the corners of the room, shadows deepened and writhed, hinting at the horrors that awaited them. But for the first time since this nightmare began, they had a plan, they had hope. The final battle was coming. And this time, they would be ready. Chapter 21, The Final Séance. The living room had been transformed once again, this time into a makeshift séance chamber. Candles flickered in a wide circle, their dancing flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. In the center, Stacy, Ben and Sarah sat around a small table, their hands linked tightly. "Are you sure about this?" Ben whispered, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "After what happened last time?" Stacy squeezed his hand reassuringly. "We have to try. We need more information, and this might be our only chance to get it." Sarah nodded, her face set with determination. "Whatever happens, we face it together." As if in response to their words, a cold wind swept through the room, making the candles gutter. The temperature plummeted, and in the corners of the room, shadows seemed to deepen and writhe. "It's trying to stop us," Stacy said through gritted teeth. "We have to push through." Taking a deep breath, she began to recite the incantation they had found in the headmistress's diary. The words felt strange on her tongue, ancient and powerful. As she spoke, the air around them began to thicken, shimmering like heat waves rising from hot pavement. Suddenly the candles flared bright, their flames stretching impossibly high. The room seemed to fade away, replaced by a swirling mist. And there, emerging from the fog, came a procession of ghostly figures. They recognized some of them from old photographs and visions, students and teachers from the ill-fated boarding school. At the front of the group stood Millicent Grace, her ethereal form more solid than the others. And beside her, small and fragile-looking, was Abbey Grace, not the twisted, malevolent entity they had faced, but the real Abbey, the child she had been in life. "You've called us," Millicent said, her voice echoing strangely. "We've come to help if we can." Stacy leaned forward, her heart racing. "We need to know the truth, all of it, about Abbey, about the entity, about how to stop it." Abbey stepped forward, her ghostly form flickering like a candle flame. When she spoke, her voice was soft, tinged with a sadness no child should know. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said. "I just wanted to help." As Abbey began to speak, the mist around them shifted and swirled, forming images that played out like a macabre movie. They saw Abbey as a young student, bright-eyed and curious. They watched as she discovered Millicent's secret research into the occult, her fascination with the unknown. "I thought it was exciting," Abbey's voice narrated, "like a storybook adventure. I didn't understand the danger." The scene changed, showing Abbey helping Millicent with small rituals, each one darker than the last. The headmistress's obsession grew, her quest for knowledge becoming a hunger for power. "She said we could make the school better," Abbey continued. "Protect the students, make them smarter, keep them safe. But the things we were calling, they wanted more than we could give." The mist swirled again, revealing the fateful night of the final ritual. They saw Abbey standing in a circle of candles, Millicent chanting words that made reality itself seem to warp and twist. "Something went wrong," Abbey whispered. "The entity we summoned, it was too strong, too hungry. It wanted a vessel, and I was. Convenient." The siblings watched in horror as the entity tore into Abbey, her small body contorting in agony as it forced its way inside her. Millicent screamed, trying to stop what she had set in motion, but it was too late. "I tried to fight it," Abbey said, tears streaming down her ghostly face. "I tried so hard. But it was too strong. It used my face, my voice, my memories. It fed on my pain, on the fear of everyone around me. And it grew. The visions faded, leaving them once again in the misty void with the spirits." Millicent stepped forward, her face a mask of guilt and sorrow. "I thought my sacrifice would contain it," she said, "and for a time it did. But the entity was patient. It waited, gathering strength, twisting the house and everyone in it to its will." Sarah spoke up, her voice shaking. "But why? What does it want?" "To exist," Abbey said simply, "to feed, to grow strong enough to break free of the house and spread across the world." Ben shuddered. "How do we stop it? There has to be a way." Millicent and Abbey exchanged a look, their expressions grave. "There is a way," Millicent said slowly, "but the cost—" "Tell us," Stacy demanded. "Whatever it is, we'll face it." Abbey stepped forward, her small hand reaching out as if to touch them, though it passed through their joined hands like smoke. "The entity can be banished," she said, "sent back to the void it came from. But it requires a sacrifice, a life freely given, with full understanding of what's at stake." The siblings fell silent, the weight of Abbey's words settling heavily upon them. It was Sarah who finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "One of us would have to die." Millicent nodded solemnly. "Not just die, willingly give their life, knowing the full horror of what they face. It's the only way to generate enough power to tear the entity from Abbey's essence and cast it out. But," Abbey added quickly, "there might be a way to increase your chances. My mother's music, it has power. If you could harness it, combine it with the sacrifice. It might be enough to tip the scales in your favor." As if triggered by her words, a haunting melody began to play, seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The spirits around them stirred restlessly, their forms flickering in and out of existence. "Our time grows short," Millicent said urgently. "The entity knows what we're doing. It will try to stop you." As if in response, a bone-chilling laugh echoed through the void. The mist began to darken, taking on an oily, malevolent quality. "You think your little seance can save you?" Abby's voice, but not Abby's voice, mocked. "I am eternal. I am hunger incarnate. And you're nothing but morsels waiting to be devoured." The candles around them flared, then guttered out. The spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the encroaching darkness. "Remember," Abby's true voice called out, growing fainter by the second, "the music is the key, and whatever happens, don't let it separate you. Together, you're strong. Apart, you'll fall." With a final violent gust of wind, the seance circle was broken. The siblings found themselves back in the living room, gasping for air, their hands still clasped tightly together. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The weight of what they had learned, of the choice that lay before them, was almost too much to bear. Finally, Stacy broke the silence. "So," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes, "one of us has to die to end this." Ben shook his head vehemently. "No, there has to be another way. We can't." "We might not have a choice," Sarah interrupted softly. "You heard them. It's the only way to stop this thing for good."
The house creaked ominously around them, as if reminding them of the evil that lurked in every shadow.
In the distance they could hear the faint strains of Abby's mother's music, a melody that now held both hope and dread. "We don't have to decide right now," Stacy said, squeezing her siblings' hands. "But we need to prepare. Whatever happens next, we face it together." "Agreed." Ben and Sarah nodded, their faces a mix of fear and determination. As they began to plan, gathering the sheet music and the remnants of the headmistress's research, none of them voiced the question that hung heavily in the air: which one of them would make the ultimate sacrifice? The final battle was approaching, and the price of victory might be higher than any of them were prepared to pay. Chapter 22. Mother's lullaby. The living room had become a battlefield. Furniture lay overturned, wallpaper peeled in long strips, and a cold wind howled through shattered windows. At the center of the chaos stood Stacy, or rather, the thing wearing Stacy's form. Her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and her lips were curled in a snarl that was more beast than human. Ben and Sarah stood at opposite ends of the room, sheet music clutched in their trembling hands. Between them lay their last hope. An old phonograph they'd found in the attic, ready to play the lullaby that Abbey Grace's mother had composed so long ago. "Now, Ben!" Sarah shouted, her voice barely audible over the tempest raging around them. Ben lunged for the phonograph, dodging a bolt of dark energy that Stacy hurled his way. His fingers found the crank, and he turned it frantically, praying the ancient machine would work. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, crackling and faint, the lullaby began to play. The effect was immediate. Stacy screamed, a sound of both rage and agony that shook the very foundations of the house. She clawed at her ears, her form flickering between Stacy and something altogether more monstrous. "Keep going," Sarah urged, beginning to sing along with the melody. Her voice wavered at first, but grew stronger with each note. Ben joined in, his deeper tones harmonizing with Sarah's. As their voices twined with the recorded music, something extraordinary began to happen. The air around them began to glow, warm golden light pushing back against the encroaching darkness. "No," Stacy howled. "You can't do this. You don't understand what you're facing." But the siblings pressed on, their voices rising in defiance. The lullaby swelled, filling the room with its haunting beauty, and as it did, they began to see something, A shimmer in the air around Stacy's contorted form, a glimpse of the real Stacy trapped within. "Stacy!" Ben called out, his voice thick with emotion. "Stacy, we're here. Fight it!" For a brief moment, Stacy's true self seemed to surface. Her eyes cleared, focusing on her siblings with a look of desperate recognition. "Ben, Sarah, help me, please." But then the darkness surged back, and Abby's malevolent presence reasserted control. "She's mine," the entity snarled. "You'll never get her back." Sarah took a step forward, her face set with determination. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "Stacy is stronger than you, and she's not alone." As if in response to her words, the lullaby seemed to grow louder, more insistent. The golden light intensified, coalescing into shimmering threads that began to weave around Abby, Stacy's thrashing form. "Remember, Stacy," Ben called out. "Remember who you are, remember us." Images began to flicker in the air around them, memories made manifest by the power of the music. They saw Stacy as a child, laughing as she chased butterflies in their backyard. They saw her on her first day of school, nervous but excited. They saw her comforting Ben during one of his anxiety attacks, her presence a balm to his frayed nerves. With each memory, the golden threads grew brighter, tightening around the darkness that had taken hold of Stacy. Stacy writhed and screamed, lashing out with tendrils of shadow that shattered what few intact objects remained in the room. But Ben and Sarah stood their ground, their voices never faltering. They poured everything they had into the song. Their love for Stacy, their determination to save her, their hope for a future free from the nightmare that had consumed their lives. And then, in a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, something broke. The darkness surrounding Stacy fractured like glass, shards of shadow exploding outward. Ben and Sarah were thrown off their feet, the breath knocked from their lungs as they hit the floor. For a long, terrible moment, silence reigned. Then a small, pained voice broke the quiet. "Ben, Sarah!" They scrambled to their feet, rushing to where Stacy lay crumpled on the floor. She looked up at them, her eyes clear and her own once more, filled with exhaustion and confusion. What happened?" she asked weakly. Ben and Sarah fell to their knees beside her, gathering her into a fierce embrace. Tears streamed down their faces as relief washed over them in waves. "You're back," Sarah sobbed. "Oh God, Stacy, you're back." But their reunion was short-lived. A low, menacing growl filled the air, and they looked up to see a roiling mass of darkness coalescing in the center of the room. It writhed and pulsed, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape. "You think this is over," Abby's voice boomed, no longer bothering with the pretense of childish innocence. "I am ancient beyond your comprehension. I have fed on the fears and sorrows of countless souls. You cannot destroy me." The siblings huddled together, facing the monstrous form before them. The lullaby still played, softer now but persistent, a reminder of the power they held. "Maybe we can't destroy you," Stacy said, her voice weak but defiant. "But we can send you back where you came from," the entity laughed, a sound that sent chills down their spines. "And how do you propose to do that, little girl? Your precious music isn't enough. You know what the price is. Are you prepared to pay it?" A heavy silence fell over the room. The siblings exchanged glances, a wordless communication passing between them. They knew what had to be done. But who would be the one to make the ultimate sacrifice? As if in answer to their unspoken question, a new sound joined the lullaby, a dog's bark, familiar and loved. They turned to see a shimmering form padding towards them, Duke, or rather his spirit, come to aid them one last time. The spectral dog looked at each of them in turn, his eyes filled with a wisdom beyond mortal understanding. Then, with a soft whine, he turned and leapt at the writhing darkness that was Abbey Grace. "No!" Ben cried out, reaching futilely for their beloved pet. But it was too late. Duke's spirit collided with the entity, and there was a flash of light so bright it seared their vision. When they could see again, both Duke and the darkness were gone. In their place stood Abbey Grace, not the monstrous entity they had battled, but the little girl she had once been. Her eyes were clear, filled with a mixture of sorrow and hope. "He did it," she said softly. "Your Duke. He weakened the entity enough for me to break free. But it's not over yet. We have to finish this, once and for all." The siblings looked at each other, tears in their eyes but resolve hardening their features. They had come too far, lost too much, to falter now. "Tell us what to do," Stacy said, her voice stronger now. Abby smiled, a sad, gentle expression. "Sing," she said simply. "Sing and remember. Your love, your bond, it's the most powerful magic of all. Let it guide you." As Abby's form began to fade, the siblings joined hands. The lullaby swelled around them, and they added their voices to its melody. They sang of love and loss, of hope and sacrifice. They sang for Duke, for their parents, for every soul that had suffered within these walls. And as they sang, the house began to change. Shadows retreated, walls groaned and shifted, and a warm golden light began to fill every corner. They were on the cusp of victory. But the final battle, they knew, still lay ahead, and the price of triumph might be higher than any of them could imagine. Chapter, the choice, the golden light that had filled the house began to fade, replaced by an eerie, pulsing glow. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like the chest of some great beast. In the center of the living room, a vortex of darkness swirled, growing larger with each passing moment. Stacy, Ben, and Sarah stood hand in hand facing the maelstrom. The lullaby still played softly in the background, a haunting counterpoint to the low, menacing growl emanating from the vortex. "It's not enough," Abbey Grace's spirit said, her form flickering beside them. "The entity is weakened, but not defeated. It's gathering its strength for one final assault. What do we do?" Ben asked, his voice trembling. "How do we stop it?" Abby's eyes were sorrowful as she turned to face them. "You know what must be done. A willing sacrifice, a life freely given." The siblings exchanged glances, the weight of the moment settling heavily upon them. They had known this was coming, but facing the reality of it was almost too much to bear. "I'll do it," Sarah said, suddenly stepping forward. "It should be me. After what I did to Mom, I have the most to atone for." "No!" Stacy cried, grabbing her sister's arm. "We've forgiven you for that." "You can't. It has to be me," Ben interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm the one the house focused on from the beginning. My OCD, my fears. They made me the perfect target. If I give myself up, maybe it will finally end." Stacy looked between her siblings, tears streaming down her face. "No," she whispered. "No, I won't let either of you do this. There has to be another way." As if in response to her words, the vortex pulsed, sending out a wave of cold that chilled them to their bones. Abby's spirit wavered, her form growing more transparent. "You must decide quickly," she urged. "The entity grows stronger with each moment we hesitate." Stacy closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. When she opened them again, there was a resolve in her gaze that hadn't been there before. "It should be me," she said. "I was the one it possessed. I'm the one with the strongest connection to it." And her voice broke slightly. "I'm the oldest. It's my job to protect you both." "Stacy, no!" Ben and Sarah began in unison, but she held up a hand to silence them. "Listen to me," Stacy said, her voice growing stronger. "We've always been strongest together, so we'll face this together. But, in the end, it has to be my choice, my sacrifice." She turned to Abby's spirit. "What do I need to do?" Abby pointed to the center of the vortex. "You must enter willingly, embrace the darkness, and then let go. Let your love for your siblings, for this house, for all the souls that have suffered here, be your guide. It's the only way to drive the entity out for good." Stacy nodded, squaring her shoulders. She turned to Ben and Sarah, pulling them into a fierce embrace. "I love you both," she whispered, "so much. Promise me you'll take care of each other." "Stacy, please," Sarah sobbed, clinging to her sister. "Don't do this." Ben couldn't speak, his body shaking with silent tears. But he met Stacy's eyes, and in that moment, a lifetime of understanding passed between them. Stacy stepped back, giving her siblings a small, sad smile. Then, before they could stop her, she turned and walked towards the vortex. As she approached, the darkness seemed to reach out for her, tendrils of shadow wrapping around her arms and legs. Stacy didn't resist. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and stepped into the maelstrom. The moment she entered, the vortex exploded outward. Ben and Sarah were thrown back, shielding their eyes against the blinding light that filled the room. The house shook, pictures falling from walls, furniture splintering, and through it all they heard Stacy's voice, raised in song. She was singing the lullaby, her voice clear and strong despite the chaos surrounding her. Ben and Sarah scrambled to their feet, fighting against the wind that howled through the room. They could see Stacy at the center of the storm, her body suspended in mid-air, wreathed in light and shadow. "We have to help her," Ben shouted over the din. Sarah nodded, grabbing his hand. Together they began to sing, adding their voices to Stacy's. The lullaby grew in power, weaving through the tempest, creating a harmony that seemed to resonate with the very foundations of the house. As they sang, memories flashed around them, not just their own, but the memories of every soul that had ever dwelled within these walls. They saw the joys and sorrows, the triumphs and tragedies, all blending together into a tapestry of human experience. And at the center of it all was Abbey Grace, no longer a malevolent entity, but the scared, lonely child she had once been. They saw her reach out, taking Stacy's hand. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, everything hung in perfect balance. Then, with a sound like 1,000 windows shattering at once, the darkness imploded. The force of it knocked Ben and Sarah off their feet once more. When they looked up, the vortex was gone. The house was still, the air clear and fresh for the first time in decades. And there, lying motionless in the center of the room, was Stacy. Ben and Sarah rushed to her side, falling to their knees beside her still form. Sarah pressed trembling fingers to Stacy's neck, searching for a pulse. "She's not breathing," Sarah choked out, panic rising in her voice. "Ben, she's not breathing." Ben began chest compressions, his own breath coming in ragged gasps. "Come on, Stacy," he pleaded. "Don't leave us. Please don't leave us." As they fought to revive their sister, a soft glow began to fill the room. They looked up to see spirits materializing around them, all the souls that had been trapped in the house now free. Abbey Grace stood at the forefront, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and hope. "It's not too late," Abbey said softly. "Your love brought her this far. It can bring her back." Understanding dawned on the siblings' faces. Together they began to sing the lullaby one last time, pouring every ounce of love and hope they possessed into the melody. As their voices rose and fell, the spirits joined in, their ethereal tones creating a chorus that seemed to transcend time and space. The glow intensified, centering on Stacy's still form. And then, with a sudden, sharp intake of breath, Stacy's eyes flew open. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, with cries of joy and disbelief, Ben and Sarah gathered Stacy into their arms, holding her as if they'd never let her go. "You did it," Abby's voice said, fading along with the other spirits. "You freed us all. Thank you." As the glow faded and the spirits disappeared, the siblings remained huddled together on the floor, clinging to each other amidst the wreckage of the room. They were battered, exhausted, and forever changed by what they'd experienced. But they were alive. They were together. And the nightmare that had consumed their lives was finally, truly over. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, a sense of peace settled over the old house. The shadows that had haunted its halls for so long were gone, replaced by the promise of a new beginning. The battle was won. But for Stacy, Ben and Sarah, the journey of healing and of truly becoming a family again was only just beginning. Chapter 24. Aftermath. The late afternoon sun streamed through the newly repaired windows of the old boarding school house, casting long shadows across the living room. Stacy sat on the couch, a cup of tea cooling in her hands as she gazed out at the sprawling front yard. The oak tree, once a symbol of dread, now stood peaceful and serene, its leaves rustling gently in the breeze. It had been 3 months since the night they had banished Abbey Grace and the malevolent entity. 3 months of healing, of rebuilding, of learning to live with the weight of what they had experienced. The sound of footsteps on the stairs drew Stacy's attention. Ben appeared in the doorway, a small smile on his face. He no longer moved with the frantic energy of before, his steps measured but relaxed.
How are you feeling?
Stacy asked, patting the spot next to her on the couch. Ben sat down, his fingers absently tracing patterns on his jeans. Better, he said. The new therapist is helping, and I haven't felt the need to count in days.
Stacy reached out, squeezing his hand.
That's wonderful, Ben. I'm so proud of you. The front door opened and Sarah walked in, arms laden with groceries. A little help here, she called out, laughing as Ben and Stacy rushed to assist her. As they unpacked the bags in the kitchen, a comfortable silence fell over them. It was still strange sometimes to be in the house without fear, to walk its halls and rooms without expecting shadows to reach out and grab them. I spoke to Roman today, Sarah said, breaking the quiet. He's doing well, says the house feels. Lighter now, cleaner. Stacy nodded, remembering the medium's pale, drawn face when he had finally regained consciousness after that fateful night. He had left soon after, needing time to process what he had been through. But he checked in regularly, a comforting link to the world outside their shared experience. Do you think we'll ever fully understand what happened here? Ben asked, his voice soft. Stacy shook her head. I don't know if we're meant to. Some mysteries, maybe they're better left unsolved. As they finished putting away the groceries, Sarah pulled out an envelope from her purse. This came today, she said, handing it to Stacy. It's from the Historical Society. Stacy opened the letter, her eyes scanning the contents. A smile spread across her face. They want to preserve the house, she said. Turn it into a museum dedicated to the school's history. What do you think? Ben asked, peering over her shoulder at the letter. Stacy was quiet for a moment, considering. I think it's a good idea. This place, its history, the good and the bad, it deserves to be remembered. And maybe, by sharing its story, we can help prevent something like this from happening again. Sarah nodded, her eyes misty. We could help with the restoration, make sure they get the story right. And we could finally move out, Ben added, a hint of relief in his voice. They looked at each other, a mixture of emotions passing between them. This house had been their battleground, their prison, and ultimately their crucible. It had nearly destroyed them, but it had also forged their bond stronger than ever before. What do you say we go for a walk? Stacy suggested. It's a beautiful day. Together they stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and new beginnings. As they walked down the driveway, Stacy couldn't help but glance back at the house. For a moment, just a fleeting instant, she thought she saw a shimmer in one of the upstairs windows. A small figure, waving goodbye. But when she blinked, it was gone. You okay? Sarah asked, noticing her hesitation. Stacy smiled, linking arms with her sister. Yeah, she said, I'm okay. As they walked down the street, their laughter drifting back towards the old house, a sense of peace settled over the property. The shadows were gone, the whispers silent. In their place was a quiet dignity, a testament to the strength of those who had faced the darkness and emerged, battered but unbroken, into the light. The house stood tall and proud, its windows gleaming in the fading sunlight. It would always carry the weight of its history, the echoes of those who had lived and suffered within its walls. But now it also held the promise of redemption, of stories yet to be told, and somewhere beyond the veil that separates this world from the next, Abbey Grace smiled. She was at peace at last, free from the bonds that had held her for so long. As she faded into the warm, welcoming light, her final whisper drifted through the house. Thank you. The end